What I'd be without you.
As in all stories of this kind, the knots are sometimes a little difficult to unravel, and the statements that some people make almost flatly contradict those of others. This can partly be put down, of course, to bad memory, but just as often to the simple fact that no two people ever see any situation in exactly the same way. Well, the one thing that can be said with certainty is that America has always had a strong tradition in vocal groups. In the 50s, there have been the R&B inspired groups like the Spiders.
Go.
And the Jewels.
Get out of my way. Downtown, dance to that rhythm and blues.
In pop, there have been groups like the Platters.
Oh, but no one can tell.
And the Diamonds, who produced a smoother version of a song that had been an R&B hit for the Gladiolas. And many, many more. As well as these, however, there were the more sophisticated, jazz-orientated groups like the Hi-Lows.
Life is just a boat. Make your dough when you go.
And the group that Brian Wilson admired so much, the Four Freshmen.
In fact, when Brian was 14, the Four Freshmen were playing someplace in Hollywood. I can't think of the club. And Murray took him. We couldn't afford to take Murray, Brian, and me. We really didn't have very much money. So Murray took Brian this one particular, I think it was a Sunday night, just in the hopes that he could meet them, because he was so thrilled with their music. And he was already writing vocal arrangements, even though he hadn't had any musical training. And he did get to meet them. And then years later, when they were the Beach Boys, they remembered having met Murray and Brian about 5 years previous to that.
That was Audrey Wilson, the mother of the three Wilson brothers. But as Beach Boy Mike Love points out, their own music, when it evolved, was a blend of two very different influences.
The influences that were upon the group in their formative years, I mean, in our youngest years, before we were the Beach Boys, were Chuck Berry, in terms of the alliterative kind of the way of his lyrics and the rhythm that he put down, but a blend of that and the more developed harmonies of the Four Freshmen, which evolved into our style, which was identified as a surfing sound. Some people call it surfing sound, some people call it West Coast sound.
In the 50s, the term West Coast sound had been synonymous with the soft sounds of cool jazz, which was ideal for just lazing about in the sunshine, particularly on the beach. But by the early 60s, a new sport had hit the coastline. The sport was, of course, surfing, defined on the back of the Beach Boys' first album as a water sport in which the participant stands on a floating slab of wood resembling an ironing board in both size and shape and attempts to remain perpendicular while being hurtled towards the shore at a rather frightening rate of speed on the crest of a huge wave. The excitement of the sport obviously demanded an energetic form of music. One person who set out to provide this music was an enthusiastic surfer named Dick Dale. He decided to form a band called the Deltones and run dances for the teenage surfers in the evenings. He adopted the raunchy rock and roll style of the late 50s and wrote some tunes that were supposed to reflect the surfing sport. He came up with titles like Surfing Drums, Death of a Gremmy, Mizzaloo Twist, Let's Go Trippin', and this one, Surf Beat.
Yeah, look 'em all.
Well, whether or not that sound conjures up the image of surfing is obviously a matter for debate, but there's no doubt that the music itself was popular with the surfing community. Incidentally, Dick Dale is obviously a talented musician, for apart from playing a right-handed guitar left-handed, he's also reputed to have played every instrument on his records. He also sang on some of the numbers, but if his version of Sloop John B is anything to go by, he certainly had little of the Beach Boys' vocal flair. Anyway, some of his audiences developed a special dance called the Surfer's Stomp, the most popular form of which involved a series of 3 side steps, followed by a hop and a shuffle. It's said that the dancers were supposed to resemble bobbing surfers trying to keep their balance on speeding surfboards, and there was even a record release called the Surfer's Stomp by another group, the Marquettes. Surfer Stomp by the Marquettes, released in January 1962. Now that sounds ideal for dancing, but didn't somehow seem to capture any of the atmosphere or the excitement of surfing itself. But the sport was exciting and had also started a new in-language full of surfing terms. Here's Dennis Wilson.
Well, they used to have the hang 10. That's the famous one. You run up the tip of the board and put both of your feet over the end of the board. You know, but now the boards are so small, you can't do that. You can stay in only one position, or your feet are fairly much stable. You can move them a bit, but not a whole bunch. Backsliding, 360, cut, you cut right or left, kick out, spinner. There's, you know, it's like in anything else, you know, like driving a car, you have a left or a right, you put on the brakes, you know, stall your board, you know. All the terms, you know.
So it was obvious that somebody just had to sing about it. Carl Wilson of the Beach Boys.
The first thing I seem to remember is Dennis and Michael going to the beach one day, a long time ago. And when they came back, they were talking about making a song about surfing and going to the beach. That's the first thing I remember about it. As far as the reality of a group, you know, I was actually forming. But
What time is this? What year is this?
oh, it's in 61, the fall of 61. But before that, we'd always, you know, got around the piano to sing, and we'd go Christmas caroling, and we've always been into music somehow for many years.
So how did you actually decide to go about pulling the band together and getting it started?
Well, just said, well, let's see, Dennis and Mike and Brian and Carl, and Brian had a friend Al, and that was, you know,
Right.
it was really simple.
Which is quite funny, since the way Al Jardine relates it, the forming of the group was far from simple. How did the band first come together?
Oh, I bet you asked everybody else the same question. That's good, because you get a cross-section of different opinions on how it got together. Each guy started the group, right? Well, yes, I started the group. No, from my point of view, it started when I met Brian Wilson. Brian and I were in rival singing groups in Hawthorne High School in Hawthorne, California, in 1959. I always admired what he did. You know, I knew that there was something happening there with his arrangements and the way he, you know, carried himself. And so after we left high school, I went off to college in the East. And I couldn't find anybody that I was really happy with, just to get together with, to sing and to harmonize and to make music. So I just hunted Brian down. I bumped into him at El Camino College. In my second year of college, came back west. My father was teaching at this other place. We came back to California to pursue another line of work, and I ended up back in Los Angeles. Went to El Camino, and I was walking across the campus, and boom, there's Brian. I said, Brian, let's do it. Let's get together. And up to that point, I'd seen Brian, I think, a year previous at a hamburger stand. You can believe that. And I dropped the word then. I said, let's get together, but I'm going back east for a year. So he said, fine, I'll see you later, you know. So this was later. Let's do it. We got together the next day in the nurse's room. It was like a medical area of the college. So we got together a football player, some deep bass singer who couldn't carry a tune, one of my friends from early high school days in my other group, and we all got together and just sang just anything we could think of. Well, that group didn't cut it too well. That group of people just didn't make it, so we had a little refinement to do. So Brian said, hey, my little brother Carl can really sing, you know. He's really good. I says, him? Are you kidding? I saw him once at high school, and he was about 3 foot tall, you know. He was about 12. He was short and just looked so funny. I thought, you know, I just said to myself, him? He says, yeah, he's young, but he's really talented, he said. I says, all right, this is great. And he says, and my cousin Mike and Maureen, you know, they can sing too. And there's Dennis, you know, and Dennis is like to do something. So we went over to Brian's the day after that, met with Mike and Dennis and Carl. And he wrote a couple of songs about a girl he was going with. One was called Judy. One was called Surfer Girl. And the other 2 tunes we did were Luau and the Surfin'. That was it. And Surfin' became our A-side on our first record.
Surfing is the only life, the only way for me now. Surf.
So the Beach Boys had their first record out, extolling the joys of surfing. Most of the surfing addicts had their favourite beaches, and Dennis Wilson used to go to
Malibu, Hermosa, and Redondo, which is on the southern part of the United States, west coast, southern side.
How much of your influence got into the Beach Boys music at that time?
I think lyrically there was an influence, you know, an idea. That was about it. I didn't participate in the writing at that time at all.
In fact, that first single, like the second, was written by Brian Wilson with Mike Love. The first one, Surfin', had been released on a small local label called Candix and had been a minor local hit. Incidentally, it was Russ Regan at Candix who gave the group their name. The names The Pendletones and Carl and the Passions were never really seriously considered. But the Beach Boys manager, Murray Wilson, decided that they could become more successful by joining one of the major labels.
My dad spent a lot of time going around to labels. Of course, we'd never had any experience in the music business, although he had a publisher whose name was Height Morgan. And Height helped my father to go to the bigger labels. I guess they just went all over wherever they could get in, but you know, the thing is you can't just go to a company. They have to say, well, yes, we'll see you and we'll talk and like that. So I think it was somewhat difficult. And Height finally gave up, and my dad kept at it and ended up at Capitol Records, and there was a guy there named Nick Vinay.
When he did call me, I told him I'd be out of town for about 2 weeks. I was going to Nashville myself. And I don't know why, but in the future, I guess the old man thought that that was a starting point, having to wait 2 weeks to see someone. But, well, anyway, he came up to the tower with the record, this building here, and they came into my office, and they had a demo of Surfin' Safari. And they played it for me, and every once in a while, as a producer, every once in a while, before the second 8 bars have spun around, you know that the record is the #1 record, whether it's a commercial, whether it's whatever, there's something about it. And I wasn't one for hiding my feelings. I mean, if I want to drive a bargain, I should have just sat there mum. But I got all excited, and I started jumping around, and I said, we have to make the deal. And of course, he got all excited, because he wasn't one to hide his feelings either. The old man wasn't. And the kids were sitting outside, as you can see right outside the door. And so I ran down the hall and knocked on the door of at that time, Vice President Voyle Gilmore. And I said, Voyle, I have to see you for 2 minutes. He says, I'm really busy. I said, well, I got to see you. We got a hit record here, and if they walk out of the office, I don't even know where to call them. He says, well, all right, put it on. So I put it on a turntable. And even though that man was in his 50s, okay, he was a professional record man, you know, he heard what I heard evidently right away. And he said, well, go back and ask them what they want for it, but for God's sake, quit dancing. I mean, I was just so excited. So I came back and I asked them what they wanted to consummate the deal, and the father asked for $300. And I went back again. I told him to stay put, and I just scared death he'd walk out of the office. And I went back, and I said, they want $300. He said, that's too much money. Now, you've got to remember, this is in the early 60s. $300 was a lot of money, evidently, for a record that wasn't a pop record with some magic sequin dressed star singing type, you know, for a bunch of greasers, you know. And I said, oh, Voyle, we can't go in and argue with the man. $300 it would cost us $300 to make it here. He insisted I ask him to sell it for $100. So I was really despondent because I didn't want to bargain with the man. So I came back in and I said, they'll give you $100. And I said, but I don't think that's fair. I mean, I was a turncoat. I said, I'll give you $300 right here. So I went back up to the office again. I told the vice president, I said, listen, I'm going to resign and buy this record and start my own company. And it took about 15 minutes arguing with me, and he talked me into staying, and he came up with he said $300 is all right. I still think it was awfully cheap, even at $300.
Let's go surfing now, everybody's learning how. Come on a safari.
So the Beach Boys had their first single out on the Capitol label in the summer of 1962. Although Capitol's promotion director Al Corey's version of how it got there isn't quite the same as Nick Venet's.
Now, this is the truth. I don't know what Nick told you, because this is the truth. Nick was very interested in one of the sides, which was 409, the hot rod side. He didn't care too much about the surfing stuff or the other music that was in the content. Now, Venet took the 4 sides in to Will Gilmore, who was then the head of A&R at Capitol. And he played the 4 sides, and he said to him, I really want to buy these records because I want 409. And so, of course, the price was very reasonable, and Gilmore authorized him to buy the records.
Well, whatever the reason, the decision as far as Capitol was concerned was the right one. It is true that they initially promoted 409, but after a few weeks they turned the record over and got behind Surfin' Safari. Nick Venet again.
We released the record, and in a period of 1 day, the company knew it was a hit record. I mean, they don't happen that fast. But that record was a hit in a matter of hours. I mean, 8 hours after it was in the field, we were getting reports from isolated spots like in Phoenix, Arizona. You couldn't go surfing in Phoenix if you tried. And yet the record was selling. I think the biggest order Capitol had had that entire year had been on the Beach Boy record in New York City, where there's absolutely no surfing. The response was tremendous. It was just an instant smash, and it just sold close to 800,000-900,000 records. It didn't qualify for a gold record. In those days, you had to sell 1 million units. Today, you do $1 million worth of business, and you get a gold record.
Maybe not a gold record, but a sizable hit, and the next move was to make an LP. But already there'd been a change in the lineup of the group. Al Jardine.
I left the group right at that point when the group went to Capitol. I made a decision that I didn't want to really put a big investment into equipment, and at the same time, I wanted to finish dental school. So, boom, okay, Al Jardine leaves the group, and there's David Marks for a year.
So it was David Marks who appeared on the first 4 albums. The first one was called Surfin' Safari, and as well as the title track, it included 409, their first single Surfin', 10 Little Indians and County Fair, the 2 sides of their second single release in England, and this hymn to root beer.
Here a mug, there a mug, everybody chug a lug. Here a mug, there a mug.
At this time, the Beach Boys were still doing the local hops in Southern California. Various other vocal groups were now getting into the music, and one of these was an all-girl group originally called the Ravel Sisters, later known as the Honeys.
My sister and my cousin and I were starting to sing together. We wanted to, make records. And I actually met Brian at a coffee house, which was called Pandora's Box. They were all on stage singing. It was this little tiny coffee house. And he spilled hot chocolate all over me. I was actually drinking hot chocolate, and he asked me for a sip of it while he was, like in between a song, and he spilled it all over me. That's how we met.
And some while later, Marilyn Ravel became Mrs. Brian Wilson. The fact that there were imitation groups was proof enough that the music of the Beach Boys had made a real impression by 1963. Nick Venet.
It was a shot in the arm to the entire industry. I mean, there was a new form of, I hate the word, but I'll use it, teenage music, as they called it. Had nothing to do with your girlfriend breaking up or you driving off a cliff in your Chevrolet. It had nothing to do with any of that. It was a pure California phenomenon. This is not like a state, it's like a country. Being California is like a nationality. And I think the Beach Boys just represented to the rest of the country California or something, or some sort of fantasy that was out there that just got triggered by the Beach Boys records, but the sales were overwhelming.
Renee Wexler is now married and living in New York, but in 1963 she was one of the youngsters in Southern California.
The Beach Boys represented a time in Southern California, and I believe now, after living away from Southern California, after talking to people who have grown up in different parts of the country, it also affected them, because kids that were growing up in Michigan were listening to Beach Boy songs and thinking, wow, that's the way it is in Southern California. And people who were 2,000 miles away from an ocean were wearing the Pendleton shirts and the blonde hair and the whole thing. It was a great time to be a teenager. It was fun. It was innocent.
If everybody had an ocean, serving USA. Yeah, everybody's
Well, Mike Love said earlier in the programme that Chuck Berry was the group's other great influence, and so with this third hit, Surfin' USA, they'd carried this to its logical conclusion by actually using one of his tunes. Carl Wilson.
The Sweet Little 16 was just a great tune, and so Brian just did an arrangement of it, and we changed it around. Brian and Michael did. Chuck Berry wasn't personally involved in that.
Although, of course, he is credited as the writer on the record. The interesting point here is that Chuck Berry's music had evolved from the black working class areas, whereas many people considered the Beach Boys' music as essentially middle class.
America has an enormous middle class. We're using the word middle class and not in the pejorative sense. At the same time, to most people, middle class is a put-down. I don't know, Americans don't want to be poor and they don't want to be middle class, and they don't want to be rich. I don't know what they want to be. They just don't want to be called either one, evidently, but middle class is really a swipe at most Americans. And I think the Beach Boys were the first ones to capture the American middle-class youth fantasy. First off, at that period of time, it was a very rich time for America. Most all kids drove to school in Chevrolets, Corvettes, $5,000, $6,000 cars, especially California, middle-class kids. And it was middle-class music. I think surfing is a middle-class sport. I think Brian is a first-generation American middle-class, and I know he's going to think this is a put-down, but it's not. It's a sociological aspect. I think he did represent middle-class American youth, and he captured their imagination.
It really was innocent. We enjoyed things. We had our parties, and we'd run out in the morning to watch our boyfriends surf, and it was an innocent time. When you look at that time today, it's almost as if it was 1,000 years ago. It seems as though it belongs in another era, because it was bright, it was cheerful, there was nothing ominous. Your whole interest in life actually was, will the surf be up, will the sun be out, and will I have enough allowance to put gas in the car? Not will the gas be there, but will I have enough allowance to pay for the gas to get to the beach? And you pool your resources with your friends. So they really represented a whole lifestyle. In other words, that lifestyle had begun. That whole surfing world in Southern California, that had started before the Beach Boys got together. But they were able to put those feelings and those times into words and into music, the things that we wanted to hear. They were talking about us, Surfer Girl. When Surfer Girl came out, it was just like, oh, that's me, or something. And that's the way we used to be. That's why, they wrote that song about me. Little surfer, little one. That was the whole thing. It was crazy.
Surfer Girl, I think, probably carried as much of a feeling as anything we've ever done. Just the way it came on, it was a very dumb track, just the guitars and the bass and drums. But it just carried something, when the vocal came in, it had some feeling, it had a spiritual thing in it. And that's a special tune for Brian.
Carl Wilson. So far we've heard about the Beach Boys' surfing music, but we haven't heard much about the other side of their output. Here's Renee Wexler again.
Most Southern California high schools were divided up between the surfers, who, everyone sort of put a bottle of peroxide on their hair and became surfers, and the greasers, which were the car clubs and, the sort of, low riders, people that, not really hoodlums. I don't want to say that. They weren't bad kids, but they were sort of the James Dean type. And so every school in Southern California was divided up between these two factions. But at the same time, there was a change also going on in the surfing community. The kids that were surfing then also became interested in cars besides their surfing. So in other words, the surfing kids wanted to hear the car songs and be true to your school, and of course at the same time they did bring over the greasers, the car boys, the ones that were painting their Chevys metallic green with orange flames, and that sort of thing. So they really got the whole audience.
She's real fine.
Beach Boys were now firmly established as a live act in Southern California, but even by the early summer of 1963, they had yet to test their popularity elsewhere. Up in Sacramento in Northern California, Fred Vale had taken on the task of raising money for a local high school. He decided to do it by holding a concert.
So I decided, well, I think I'll check out this Beach Boy thing, because they sound like they'd really be fun to work with. They're all young guys, and the music is quite good, and I like their vocal thing. And so I called around Los Angeles and finally found out that William Morris Agency, which is, of course, one of the world's largest talent agencies, had just signed the group, and they were going to be representing the group worldwide. So I said I'd like to buy the group, and he says, well, are you in Los Angeles? I said, no, it's going to be for a concert in Sacramento, California, which is about 450 miles north. And he said, well, I'll talk to their father, Murray Wilson, who handles the boys, and we'll see if we can get together on a date. So I gave them a date or two and decided that we would have the show in May, which was, a month or so before school was to let out for summer. So they presented the offer to the boys, and the boys agreed to do the show. But then they realized that they had to fly or drive north, and they were used to just doing neighborhood functions where they could all hop in the family car and throw the amplifiers and guitars in the trunk and leave. So the Morris Agency came back to me and asked me if I would be willing to pay for either 6 round-trip airline tickets or increase the fee to $750. And not wanting to get involved in airline tickets and other expenses and things like that, I said, well, fine, I'll just give the boy $750 flat. And within 3 or 4 weeks, I presented the Beach Boys for what was probably to become their first feature concert with them as the star headline attraction. And this was in May of 1963. I really felt that I was just one of the gang, and I met the Beach Boys at the plane, and I can remember the boys and Murray, their father, getting off the plane, and we all went over to the baggage claim area to pick up the musical instruments and the amplifiers. And here are the 5 Beach Boys who ranged in age at that time from approximately 15 or 15 and a half to 22, 23. Mike Love, I believe, was the oldest. Brian was not with the group at this particular engagement. Brian was home in Los Angeles. And Al Jardine was replacing Brian for that particular concert. Alan was really not a member of the group at that time. And we loaded the equipment into my station wagon, and we drove to the auditorium, we set up the equipment, and the boys went on. And at that time, the boys were doing 2 sets. They would go on and do a 40 or 45-minute show, and then there'd be an intermission, and then the boys would come back and do an additional 40 or 50-minute show. They didn't have enough of their own material to do 2 sets, and they were doing other people's material at the time. Al Jardine was singing the Del Shannon hit Runaway, and Dennis was doing 1 or 2 of Dion DiMucci's recordings. I think he was doing The Wanderer or Runaround Sue, and of course they were always closing their shows even back then with Johnny B. Good, which is an old Chuck Berry classic. And they would do a 4 Freshman tune, a thing called Graduation Day, which showed their fantastic vocal harmonies.
There's a time for joy, graduation.
The Beach Boys' tribute to the 4 Freshmen, recorded in Sacramento about a year after the concert Fred Vale promoted. But back to May 1963.
After the show was over, we went back to their hotel where they were staying, and we were all sitting around a large table talking about the concert and the reaction of the Beach Boys that evening, which was fantastic. Obviously, they had seen success in Los Angeles, but this was a city that was 400 or 500 miles away, and it wasn't near the ocean, and they just weren't quite expecting it. They were all thrilled. So we were all discussing the concert and the Beach Boys' success, and we were figuring out how much we would net out of the evening's performance. And having figured out their expenses for the evening, Murray told me that the boys had made about $52 apiece net after all the expenses and agency commission. And they asked me how much I had made. Well, I had made between $3,000 and $4,000 net. And Murray, along with the rest of the boys, were amazed that a kid, quote, myself, could put together a show and make this kind of money when they, as the performers, were only making a very, very minimal amount, particularly if you compared it to what I was making as the promoter. And I felt that there was really no reason why the Beach Boys should make thousands and thousands of dollars for promoters when it was really the Beach Boys who should be making that kind of money for themselves. And the William Morris Agency at the time was booking the boys for $250, $350, $500, $800 a night. And I foresaw promoters getting fat and rich off of the Beach Boys and their popularity. So I mentioned to Murray, if I can have this kind of a success in Sacramento, California, obviously there are other cities where the Beach Boys' popularity is just as great, and perhaps the Beach Boys should think about doing some of their own shows where they can actually promote their own concert dates. And Murray thought this was fantastic, and he thought it was a good idea, but he told me that he certainly couldn't give it the time necessary to go out on the road and set up shows and produce shows. So I said, well, heavens, I'm not doing anything. You know, let's enter into an agreement, and I'll go out and investigate and check out cities. And if I felt that the city warranted us putting up our money to front a show or promote a show, we would do that, and we would somehow or another devise a way of compensating me. Because here I am, 19, 20 years old, and that night was more money than I had ever seen as far as a one-night salary or one-night fee or one-night net. And I was quite anxious to continue my relationship with him, because even in 6 or 7 hours during that evening, or the course of the evening, I had become very, very attached to the Beach Boys and felt a very, very close relationship to them. What we actually set up in our brief conversation that night became the format, you might say, of American Productions, which was the Beach Boys' quite successful concert production firm. And the next show that we did together, they went from this $500 to $800 a night flat fee that the William Morris was booking them for to about $3,000 or better a night. And I can remember one evening coming back from an engagement and not being prepared to handle all the money that would come in that night at the box office. We had stuck dollar bills and change and $5 bills in our pockets and in briefcases, and we'd even resorted to shopping bags and regular paper sacks, you might say. We came back to the hotel and we just dumped all this money on a big bed in the hotel room, and the boys were just totally in shock, bewildered to see $3,000 or $4,000 in cash, and it was all theirs, and they were excited as kids. It was like Christmas in May or June or July, whatever month it happened to be. I think it was November, as a matter of fact. And this, of course, was the beginning of their quick and rapid rise to popularity, and the success that Murray and I had with these shows opened the eyes of agents and managers, the William Morris Agency, promoters all over the country, and people began to realize the potential impact of the Beach Boys and began to give serious consideration to the boys as a major attraction and not just a Southern California, quote, phenomenon.
Catch a wave and you're sitting on top of the world. On top of the world.
Well, that was Catch a Wave from the Beach Boys' third LP, Surfer Girl. By this time, however, there was increasing disagreement between Murray and their record producer, Nick Vinay.
Of course, he was their father. Had he been a professional manager, unrelated to the group, I could have probably seen my way through the arguments and argued on a professional level and continued working with him. But because I was arguing with someone who was blood related, whenever I told him he was wrong or foolish, the entire band took it as a slander against the family. So it was very difficult. And after the first few LPs and the first singles, I started becoming a coordinator for them here at Capitol. They were making their own records, and that was no fun for me. I liked working with people, so gradually we just separated.
So, as well as having control over their concert bookings, the Beach Boys and their father now had the freedom to make their own records, which proved an even more significant move. As we saw at the end of the last programme, the Beach Boys had begun by the middle of 1963 to become more firmly established, and were obviously not just another group to be thrown up by the latest craze. They had a lasting quality. Al Khoury, National Promotion Director for Capitol Records.
Once we got the first couple of hits out of the way, they became a very important rock group, you know. Even way back then, when we were going from record to record with them, they were recognized by some of the important radio people and even some of the more important young critics in those days. They were always accepted as being an exceptionally excellent vocal group, and they always came up with good records.
They started off with surfing, and then, of course, and Be True to Your School. I mean, you could have been a scholar and loved Be True to Your School. You didn't have to be a surfer or a greaser. You could have just been a whatever was in between. Yeah. The kids that really took no sides, that were just sort of there.
When some loud bragger tries to put me down and says this.
Be True to Your School, and incidentally that was the original single release and not the version to be found on the LP Little Deuce Coupe. To really capitalise on this success, the group obviously had to start touring outside of California, and it was the task of Ira Oken at the William Morris Agency to arrange this for them.
Those really, really early days were really not that difficult because they seemed to catch on quite a bit all over the country. No, the one place we did have a problem booking them at the beginning was the Southeast. They didn't want any part of the Beach Boys, but we had a lot of dates in the Midwest and a lot of dates on the West Coast, and the Beach Boys did business right away. They were one of those acts that just immediately seemed to catch on. And the first major tour that I booked for them, they did tremendous business. It was incredible. We didn't believe the numbers they did. Well, we were booking them at a guarantee against a percentage, and they were taking out like triple and quadruple the monies and percentage that they had gotten in the way of guarantees. That's how hot they were. That's the kind of business they were doing.
And promoter Irving Grants also became involved with them at this time.
The William Morris Agency had booked them on a big tour, and Brian Wilson, the leader at that time, refused to go because they had a 2-day drive or 3-day drive before they came to Oklahoma City, which is where the tour began. So Ira Oken, who was the agent, asked me to fill in dates or cities before the first one so they could play their way through. And he said, just book them no matter what. Just get them in there, we don't care what, because they had all the money in for the tour, and whatever else would have been profit. So I said, well, you know, you have nothing to lose. And I booked them in a college who thought they were a folk act because I had played folk groups there before. And we played there 2 shows, I'll never forget that. And the ceiling came down from the vibration of the guitars because they'd never had anything like that before. It was really wild. I mean, you're standing in an auditorium, all of a sudden a big piece of cement falls down. They barred rock and roll, incidentally, after that show. They wanted to know everything. You had to send them records and what the music was like. Every time I wanted to book an act, and even Bill Cosby they weren't sure of. Where was this? At the University of Arizona in Tucson, in Tempe.
Well, although they can also see the funny side of it now, Mike Love and Al Jardine are glad things have changed.
Thank goodness our tours have gotten progressively better. In the first tour we went out with like a station wagon. And we got so crazy in that station wagon, it was ridiculous. There were 5 of us and a driver, and we all lugged our own instruments, you know, and we'd drive sometimes 500 miles to the next date because the routing wasn't that great, you know. We'd be in Fargo, North Dakota, and then we'd go somewhere in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and then over to, we went from one place like northern Michigan to New York.
That was it, no, Massachusetts.
Yeah, after the first ballroom tour like that we went on, I said never again. So we were in the back seat of a station wagon together one day. I remember broad daylight. We pulled up and we said, okay, you guys, let's all jump in the back and freak this gas station attendant out. So we all jumped in the back of the station wagon, and all 5 or 6 of us were piled up together like just writhing and just squirming around with legs and arms hanging everywhere. And then the guy comes up with the hose in the gas place, the petrol place, whatever, and he just blew his mind. There were 5 guys just crawling over each other in the back of the station. But that's how crazy we got in that first tour. So, but now, I mean, you know, the next tour I said never again. So I bought a Jaguar, my first real nifty car, and I took out the right-hand seat and I made a bed in it. So there were 3 of us in the car. One guy would be able to sleep, one guy would be resting, and you know, sitting in back, and one guy would be driving. And it worked out really well. I remember going down the country roads about 130 miles an hour. This one friend of mine went out on tour with us, and he's a real scaredy cat when it comes to driving. We were driving out through Arizona in the desert, and he said, Mike, keep it down to 65. Okay, I said, come on, 65, you know, I was going about 80, and then I'd be going 90, and he'd say, oh, keep it down to 70 or 80, please. And then I was going 100, and he said, please, keep it down to 80. Finally, I had him on the floor begging, please, Mike, keep it down to 100, please. But I was going about 135 on the gauge. I remember clocking on an average 120 miles an hour between one point and another for about a 50-mile stretch.
Well, we've already heard on a couple of occasions of Brian's reluctance to appear at the concerts. So what effect did this have on the rest of them? Al Jardine.
Well, it affected his father very intensely. His dad was really uptight about it. Felt that he was copying out or felt that he was dodging responsibilities, and gave him a pretty rough time. So I think that affected the group. Yeah, because we felt the repercussions from that because he was still our manager at the time. So it was a little confusing, actually.
But Brian was adamant. Carl Wilson.
He just said, I don't want to tour. I want to stay home, and I want to make up music. And I remember my dad was upset about that. He thought it wasn't fair for him not to go and play for the people because they bought the records and they wanted to see him and so on. So anyway, he just wouldn't do it because he wanted to write. And then Alan came in the group to take Brian's place. And then when David Marks left the group, then Brian came back in. And then Brian stayed until the end of the year, and I remember it was in Houston. And then he just really got upset, and he just had to leave. He was like, I think that's one of what people call as nervous breakdowns, but it wasn't really. It was just, he was just holding it in, and it just came out. Just said, no, I can't do it, you know, and I'm stopping, and that was it. It was a thing where it hurt his ears, you know, because he can only hear in his left ear, so I think all the high sound pressure level, you know, it's just too much.
And Marilyn Wilson agrees that the ear trouble was certainly one of the reasons Brian stopped touring.
On stage, it's just too painful for him. It really hurts him, and they play loud on stage. And that was one factor, which really came later. I think the main reason at the beginning was because he couldn't write and tour at the same time. Touring, it's a hectic life. It's really hard. And Brian, that's not his makeup. He had to be home, and he had to write and get all the vibrations from everywhere in order to, you know, do his thing. So I think that's what mainly did it. And we just got married, which also helped, you know.
Did he miss being on stage with the band?
Yeah, I think he did. I really do. Because, well, no, he didn't miss it as much as he loved staying home.
So now, with Brian out of the touring band more or less permanently, a replacement voice was needed. Various people were tried, including Delaney Bramlett, but eventually it was Glenn Campbell who was brought in.
I was with him for 6 months. I took Brian's place, singing the high part, and I played bass in the group. That was a lot of fun.
But how did they come across him? Al Jardine explains.
He used to record on a lot of our records. He used to play guitar, backup guitar. I don't think he played lead. He just did a lot of guitar work on a lot of the things that we did. I mean, we knew he could sing. I don't know how, but I remember hearing it coming up. Hey, what about Glenn? And I said, yeah, he can sing. I think he can sing high as well. And I know he can play guitar because he did a lot of our sessions. He looked nice. He was a nice-looking guy. And just seemed to fit in for that period of time.
So why did he leave after 6 months?
I'm probably too much of an individual to... I was with the Champs for a while, and I enjoyed it at the time, but I didn't really like being responsible for something that a group did. And that's the way I felt when I was with the Beach Boys. If the Beach Boys did something, then I did it, and I didn't like that at all. I wanted to do what I wanted to do, and that was the goal that I shot for, really.
Meanwhile, Brian had a little more time and freedom to concentrate solely on the music and to consider whether it might be a time for a slight change in direction. Mike Love.
I think the lyrics in I Get Around are kind of express or implied, stating that I'm getting bugged driving up and down the same old strip. We got to find a new place where the kids are hip, meaning increased awareness, broadened awareness. We've done this before. We said surfing and this and that, and we were so aware that too many people took the group and its image for its surface value alone, California and all this and that, and not enough people, it seemed, could hear the harmonies or the arrangements that went into them. Yet there were plenty of people who when they delved deep into the music, found that God, there's a heck of a lot there, there's a lot of harmony, and that was our initial love, was to get together and just harmonize. Brian is so overwhelmingly musical, and you defer to his judgment, Often you add in an idea here for a structure there, like, for instance, in I Get Around, it used to start like a slow ballad approach. Da-da-da-da-da, 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 I get around. I said, wait a second. Why don't we start it like, right on top of it, like on Bob Brown. It goes ba, ba, ba. And why don't we do it like round, round, get around, I get around. And so that it changed from the ballad approach to that approach. Although I'm sure the other approach would have been beautiful, But we all just kind of gave our ideas, on arrangements. But Brian really was the musical. Of course, everybody knows that. Mastermind of the whole thing.
Round, round, get around, I get around, yeah, get around, round.
That's great. That was I Get Around, and in fact that proved to be the first Beach Boys #1 record in America, and also their first big hit in Great Britain. This prompted a visit to Britain by the group, and we'll be hearing about that in a few moments. Although I Get Around was the first #1 for the Beach Boys, it was not the first #1 in which Brian Wilson had been involved. Exactly a year before, Surf City had been at the top of the charts by Jan and Dean. Dean Torrance tells how their relationship with Brian and the Beach Boys originally came about.
The working relationship with Brian started very accidentally, in that we knew that sometime or another we were going to have to work with them on the same show, and it ultimately happened. And some little record hop down in their area, which was Hawthorne. So there was just the two of us on this particular show. They, being a self-contained band, and we were not, the only way that they could do the show was to back us up. I mean, they could do their own set, and then they would have to stay on and back us. So consequently, we all got together a couple hours before the show and rehearsed our repertoire, which was maybe 3 songs, which were probably a song that was 4 or 5 years old at that time called Baby Talk, and another song, Heart and Soul, which was a few years after that. And we had a record that had just come out that was going to be a national hit called Linda. And then we probably had a couple of old traditional things that they could play, Louie Louie or whatever. Maybe 4 songs, 4 or 5 at the very most. In those days, that was a long show, half an hour. It was really a marathon. We kind of immediately all took to each other pretty well. They went on, did their set, and we came on and did our set, And the reaction to it was a reaction that was a little bit more intense than we had felt before. So after we had finished our set, they just didn't want us to go. So we didn't know any more songs. So we asked the Beach Boys if they wanted to do their set over again, sing Surfin' and Surfin' Safari, since we knew how to sing those. And I think that's where the breakthrough really happened, in that they saw that we were perfectly willing to do their songs, and that just usually wasn't done. You never acknowledged the other person. It was really fun, and we really had fun doing not our same old usual songs that we were tired of, and adding 2 vocal parts into their sets were really interesting. And driving home after that, we discussed doing those songs. We said, those are so much fun. We were about ready to go in the studio and record an album, which would be a follow-up to the single Linda. And we said, on the Linda album, let's do some surfing songs and see how it works. Because it was really fun. And it was really fun putting those male voices in harmonies. We're used to putting girls and or just instruments doing harmony parts. Consequently, when we got in the studio, we had a small budget to work with, so we called Brian and said, look, we want to do Surfin' and Surfin' Safari on our new album. And he was thrilled. So we said, well, there's just one catch. Can you play the tracks for us? Can you get the guys up and cut the tracks? Because we're really short on money, and it's going to be tight, budget-wise. And he was thrilled with doing that, too. So all the guys came into the studio and played the basic tracks to Surfin' and Surfin' Safari. And then we said, well, while you're here, we may as well do the vocal parts. And so we did all the vocal parts together, adding our parts in, which gave them more bottom and more top. You know, long story short, it just went from there. And in that particular session, Brian gave us Surf City.
And so, with the increased time Brian had now at his disposal, he was able to collaborate with Jan and Dean on more big hit records, like Drag City. Jan and Dean, and as well as Drag City, there were snatches there from Dead Man's Curve, Little Old Lady from Pasadena, and the one that sounds so much like Catch a Wave, Sidewalk Surfing. Now, I said a few minutes ago that the success of I Get Around prompted a visit to Great Britain by the group, and this was one tour that Brian didn't want to miss. Amongst their many fans in England was Tony Rivers of Tony Rivers and the Castaways, and he can remember the first time he heard one of their records.
At the time, we were just a semi-professional group, you know, just interested in harmony, but without ever having heard any real American acts, which really got a modern sound with harmony and electric guitars. And I suddenly heard one down the radio, Fun, 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 and, you know, what? That sounds pretty lethal. And I just went out and bought the record, and then I realised it was on an album, Shut Down Volume 2. There never was a Volume 1, but cause I searched high and low for that. And after hearing that album, I was hooked completely.
Now then, just before we go any further, let's clear up the mystery about Shut Down Volume 1. Now, there was an album titled just Shut Down, but only 2 tracks on it were by the Beach Boys. There was the title track and 409, and then numbers like Brontosaurus Stomp by the Piltdown Men, 4 on the Floor, Wide Track, and Street Machine by the Superstocks, Hot Rod Race by Jimmy Dolan, and even a number by Robert Mitchum called The Ballad of Thunder Road. Anyway, back to Tony Rivers.
Then I read that EMI were bringing them over, so I immediately found out all the details, because I was with EMI at the time. We went to EMI and we met Carl. We had something about they had problems with their equipment, so we offered to lend them our van. You know, we big exciting moment for us. The magical Beach Boys are here, and we offered to take their guitars back to the Hilton, I think it was. It was myself and our drummer and our roadie, a Motley Crew, have you heard of one? And Carl Wilson, and I believe it was Dennis. We drove down Oxford Street, and Carl was saying, "Oh, gee, I love your cute little buildings." And we thought, well, we never thought anything of Oxford Street. It's just Oxford Street, but they were so knocked out with it, all the history and all this rubbish, We went back to the hotel, and we went out for a meal afterwards, and was the big American Carl paid the bill, and we was all most excited by it all. And we found out we saw their itinerary, they showed us it. And they were doing a BBC broadcast, which was the funniest thing ever. I mean, we went down to the Playhouse Theatre on the Embankment, and it was Bernie Andrews producing a session. And we thought, great, we're going to actually, because we'd been dying to hear them play. We'd only heard the records, and we wanted to hear them play and sing. And so there they were on the stage at the Playhouse Theatre. First time I'd ever seen this, because there were 5 of them singing. They all stood round the one microphone, and Al Jardine's only probably about 5'3" or something silly, and he was standing on a chair at the back of them all. This made us laugh to start with. But they couldn't really, for want of a better phrase, get it together. They were trying, and they were, how it is on recordings, and when you can't quite get something, you all look at each other, and you end up, someone giggles, and then someone makes a rude noise, and in the end, they were all in stitches on the floor. They just couldn't get going, They were, in all groups, you get someone who's trying to get the thing going, and there's someone who doesn't want to do it. He just wants to mess about and go, yeah. And that was Dennis. He was really acting silly, and they really sounded quite childish, especially from the producer's point of view, because if ever you're a producer someone and in the studio they're going, oh, you don't get the point of the joke. You're just sitting there waiting to press your little button and record it. And this must have gone on for, I can't really say, but it's at least 20 minutes, I think, and they were just laughing. And Bernie Andrews kept saying over the intercom, are we ready then, fellas, trying to retain some sort of British decorum. And the Beach Boys were collapsing about in laughter, and we were all in fits, because it's quite infectious when you're in there. And then suddenly Bernie Andrews comes storming out, right down the aisle at the front there. He gives them a right, which for me was really surprising, because I thought, all these big stars, he won't say anything, but he did. He came out and he gave them a right going at, And then Dennis suddenly changed his mood. He suddenly became the big tough guy. And Dennis said, look, man, he went on to say they've been touring all around Europe and are shattered at the moment, and they don't take that sort of talk from anybody. And we went, sort of pretending we weren't there. And anyway, they finally got it together. When they did it, which is the reason I brought this point up in the first place, when they finally got down to it, it sort of knocked us back in our seats. We were really staggered. We couldn't believe that they used guitar, bass and drums, just really basic playing. But all these great voice parts, all these different... I mean, Carl wasn't playing all these chords on guitar. He was playing basic chords, really. But they were singing these beautiful chords across it. We thought, wow, this is tremendous, And Brian Wilson sort of noticed that we were jigging about in our seats. And at the end of the number, when the red light had gone off, we all clapped, We really were so knocked out with it. A few minutes later, there was a lull between recordings, and Brian Wilson actually came over to us. It sounds like God worship, which it isn't, but... at the time we were a bit starry-eyed, He came over to us, and for the first time that week he spoke, and because up to then I thought he was a really moody sort of person. He came over and he said, did you like that? We said, sure, we'd never heard anything from a modern group to touch that, and he, from that moment on, he was full of talk. He was raving about the Four Freshmen and asking us about how we sang. It was just that one link between... Some people you don't get on with, other people you do, but he may have been one of those people who had to find something mutual that you both liked. But as soon as he knew that we liked that, he was full of chat, and the whole atmosphere was different, and I think even Bernie Andrews was happy.
When I grow up to be a man.
Well, I'm sure you'll have noticed that we just played the record of When I Grow Up, although the group did record that number on the session Tony was talking about. Unfortunately, the original tapes have now been destroyed, so if you're listening now and you recorded that session, which was broadcast on one of the original Top Gear programmes on the Old Light programme, October the 19th, 1964 was when it was broadcast, We'd certainly like to hear from you. The visit to England was part of a 24-day trip to Europe, which included a concert at the Olympia in Paris, radio and TV appearances in Berlin, Frankfurt, Munich and Rome, another concert in Stockholm, and a visit to Copenhagen. A good chance for all the group to soak up some European culture, particularly Mike Love.
It was late at night. Everybody's asleep in Britain, but we can't sleep. So we go out to trying to find some place to eat, and that's not working out too well. So we went out to this real late night spot, and they had some fried potatoes and, and something to eat. So Alan and I were sitting down eating, minding our own business, and there's this girl that comes up to us and sits down. Haven't I seen you fellas before? We said, well, of course, we hope that she has, because we're thinking, this is our first trip to England. Gee, I hope somebody's promoting us. Maybe she has seen us before, or is she just trying to come on, because she definitely wasn't selling newspapers, I'll tell you. So we were sitting there, and she's talking to her. She's a real nice girl, so we're talking to her. And we're eating and everything, and it was all enjoyable. And then she says, I know you guys from somewhere. I said, oh, come on, how do you know? And she said, I don't know, I just have the feeling I do. So she said, can I come and dance for you? And we said, what? So she wants to come and dance for us. So we got in a cab. But the mind-blowing thing that happened is on the way over to the hotel in the cab, we copped out and we told her what we did for a living, right? We're in a singing group. She says, that's where I saw you. I have this little EMI postcard-sized picture of you fellows, And the thing that got me even worse is that she says, what kind of music do you like? And we said, oh, this and this and this. And she says, I love the Four Freshmen. And we almost fell out of the cab. She loves the Four Freshmen. So we end up driving back to London Hilton with this young lady. She's singing the melody for The Hearts Were Full of Spring, and Al and I were singing the harmony, and we're singing The Hearts Were Full of Spring going back to the... That killed me. We were wide awake anyway, so she comes up to our suite, we're sharing a room, sharing a suite in the London Hilton. We come in there, and she's, oh, pretty nice, And so she wants to dance for us, so she turns on BBC. And she starts dancing around and everything. It's amazing.
Dance, Dance, Dance was the next single release when the Beach Boys got back to California after their European tour. But the other song on the single was also good, and one that Mike Love had written with Brian a year previously.
In the Warmth of the Sun, Brian and I wrote the night before President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. And it was pretty weird because I can remember feeling very, moody, a very eerie feeling, a haunting feeling about this particular song. And if you play that song, that it's very haunting. I think you'll agree. It's kind of wistful and whatever adjectives you can use to describe it. But anyway, we wrote it about losing someone that was close. I had someone in mind that I had been very much in love with, and then it just didn't work out, And still I have the warmth of the sun, meaning the warmth of that memory within. So we wrote that till about 3 in the morning, and then we crashed, went to sleep, and the next thing we heard was a radio announcement, of Kennedy being shot.
That particular song was one of the favourites of Murray Wilson, the Beach Boys manager, and it's his relationship with them that we now take a look at. Without doubt, he did work very hard for the group. Audrey Wilson, his wife.
I think he did about 7 jobs that would now, today, take 7 different men. And it was without experience, except just a native intelligence and just a tremendous pride, and loved his sons, a lot. And just wanted them always to be better, always to be stronger, always be honest. Oh, God, they heard that enough. They had so much trouble with producing in the beginning, because Brian really was doing the producing, but there was a producer at Capitol who claimed that, he wanted his little claim to fame. And the boys wanted to record in another studio other than Capitol. And I remember Murray argued with the vice president of Capitol for 5 straight months. And they would argue. I could sit across the room and hear Royal Gilmore, right? I could hear his voice. Just Murray and he would just be screaming at each other. But Murray got his way.
The subject of that dispute between Murray and Foyle Gilmore was, of course, producer Nick Venet, and so perhaps that ought to be borne in mind as he recounts the difficulties that arose between the group and Murray, even in the early days.
First off, everyone in the company agreed, including myself, everyone agreed that Brian, without a doubt, was becoming, and I hate to use the word genius, because it's not fair to tag that on anyone, but he was a bright talent who had just scratched the surface of making records. And the father, who has passed away, so that makes it even more difficult, so I'm just going to state the things I know about him. I thought he was boxing Brian in. And then the man would come up with his own melodies. He was competing with Brian also. He would write songs on the piano, melodies, and have people write lyrics to them, and they were really kind of syrupy old pop songs type things. And I think that this was the beginning split there. I think that Brian started to realize, whether it was conscious or subconscious, that the father was in a sense a competitor. I know you shouldn't fear competition, but had he not been related, I think he could have done whatever he wanted to do, such as show his own songs, that kind of thing. I think it would have worked out. But again, because he was blood related, it became family competition. And I could see it driving things apart. One instance in the studio, they asked me to make sure he wasn't at the studio. And I agreed. I would ask him not to come by the studio that night. Then he called me and told me that they had just patched up their argument and he'd like to come by. Of course, I was thinking again on the family level that he is related to them. It was wonderful they patched up their argument. I said, well then, indeed, please do come by the studio. Unknown to me, they hadn't patched up, and it was just another family, as only a family can argue. I can say things to my brother that if anybody else said it to him, I'd have to punch them in the mouth. And there he was at the session. I'm in the middle, and they were at the session, and just an entire family argument ensued. And no matter what I did, I was wrong. If I picked a side, I was wrong. You can't. And I could see it slowly falling apart. And I could see Brian, all this bright talent, all this energy getting boxed in because of a family tie.
I'm one day, but he jerked my phone right out of the wall.
But whatever the disputes, Murray's enthusiasm for the group never waned.
He loved music and he loved, us. And it was his everything. I mean, he was into it. He let it all out.
Was he a strict disciplinarian with the band in the early days, Dennis?
Yeah, kind of, but not really. I mean, he, but down deep he was a joker, He just would wail,
He got more into it than I don't know anybody who could get down more, and into it more than my dad. I mean, he got into it so far, it would frighten us sometimes. He helped us learn how to make records, really, because he would listen to the vocals and, and talk to us and hype us and do all sorts of stuff to get us to sing better and to punch when we were tired or something, And like to see him in the room, through the window when you're singing, like it's a freak out sometimes. Because he just...
In the booth, what about the shows?
Yeah.
We do shows, and you know how you want to look pretty cool on stage. We were 17 and being cool. Here's my dad, runs down the center of the show going, treble, going like this, and everyone's looking at him, Okay. He's amazing. Nothing to stop him.
Dennis Wilson with a few words off mic from Carl. Yet despite his enthusiasm, Murray and the group finally discontinued their managerial relationship. Audrey Wilson again.
The boys just really weren't happy. They really weren't. And I think at that time they were going through, really growing pains, and they had grown so fast, and they thought they really knew more than they did. They've said so since. And Murray wasn't happy either. He was miserable most of the time. So it seemed a natural thing.
And Carl Wilson.
It was just too much tension in the family. I think it was difficult separating the family thing from the group thing, and he was having to function in a couple different ways. He was great for us, he really was. And after he was not our manager anymore, he still always helped the group in a lot.
So Murray was no longer the group's manager, although he did stay on to run the publishing company for Brian's songs called Sea of Tunes. But if some people are equivocal in their feelings towards Murray, the group's friend and advisor, Fred Vale, is certainly not.
I don't have enough words of praise to say for the man, really. If I was in show business as a performer, there's only one person that I've ever met in my life that I would have manage me, and that's Murray Wilson. When Murray wanted something, he'd go right to the top. He would camp outside of the president of Capitol Records for hours, if necessary, to see the man if he felt the Beach Boys needed something. Maybe it was new publicity pictures, maybe it was a page ad in Billboard, maybe it was the fact that the last photo session hadn't turned out well. He knew there was an album coming up, and he wanted to make sure that the graphics for the album were top-notch and not mediocre. He was just the type of guy that wanted so much for them that he gave up a lot of himself. Murray was a gentleman in a business that unfortunately is not made up of a lot of gentlemen. There are a lot of very, very successful business people in entertainment. I wish all of them had the humility and pride and love and concern and honesty of a Murray Wilson. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. And unfortunately, as a result, many groups and many artists who achieve major success look back 10 years later and say to themselves, well, where in the hell did it all go?
As the title of this part suggests, we'll be spending most of the programme looking at the making of the Pet Sounds album and also at its reception when it was released. Glenn Campbell had joined the band briefly but had left to pursue his own career. Another old friend of the Beach Boys was Bruce Johnston.
In 1963, I was working at Columbia Records across the street from where they were recording, and also when Jan and Dean were having their kind of successful, similar Beach Boys sounds. It was all kind of a little triangle. Here was Columbia Records, and then Western Recorders across the street, and then next door to Western United. And I kind of met them through just making similar records.
'Cause we're gonna shut you down all the time.
That was a song called Trophy Machine, written by Bruce Johnston and Terry Melcher, and sung by the group they were involved in, the Ripcords. They themselves had also recorded under the name of Bruce and Terry. Anyway, back to Bruce.
A couple of years passed, and I was asked by Mike Love to find somebody to replace Brian because Brian couldn't go on a tour. So I called a few people, and they wanted someone yesterday. It was a real rush thing. And I said, well, look, Mike, I can't find anybody. I'll come. I don't play bass. I play piano, but I suppose I could sing all the parts if you show me what you want me to do. So about an hour later, I was on my way down to the airport, and I flew to New Orleans, and that was in April of 1965, and I performed with the group, and I completed the tour, came home, and they asked me to go on another tour, so I said, well, all right. I mean, I was still working for Columbia Records as a record manager, and I was kind of reluctant to leave because I felt that Brian would come back in the group. But what happened was I came home, I think from the second tour, And they just said, well, why don't you come down and sing on the next album? I said, well, all right. And it was called Summer Days and Summer Nights. And the first song that I sang on was California Girls.
Well, as Bruce Johnston said, California Girls was recorded for the Summer Days and Summer Nights album, which came out in June 1965, although it was also released as a single a month later. There are some other fine songs on that album too, including this short one sung a cappella.
You're so sweet.
The Beach Boys and Your Dream Comes True. And it's interesting that on the back of the album cover, Brian comments that he's writing his sleeve notes at a coffee table where Carl, Ron Swallow and Earl Leaf, two friends of theirs, and three girls are all sitting around singing Beatles songs. But my mind's somewhere else right now, says Brian. I'm still working on ideas for this album. We had an unbelievable hassle trying to finish up the songs. Perhaps it was a combination of these factors that gave Brian the idea for their next album to be released in the November of that year. It was called simply Beach Boys Party and included their versions of 3 Beatles songs and various other tunes that they sometimes sang. Carl Wilson's quite honest about their reasons for recording it.
That was really just to give us time. We just did that so we'd have time to do Pet Sounds. And so it only took a few days, and that was it. And then I thought it was a pretty odd record at the time. But then we were having the pressures from Capitol Records to give us another one of these, give us another record, you know, like that. So we got caught up into the business part of it. Definitely did.
But once again, business for the Beach Boys was good, particularly for the song that was lifted from the album for their next single. Here's Dean Torrance of Jan and Dean.
Now, Barbara Ann came off an album called the Beach Boy Party album. Now, the original concept for that was that the Beach Boys were having a party, and of course, us being one of their closest friends musically and personally, we would be at the party too. And it would be acknowledged that we were at the party, and or other people, whoever we could clear legally, would also be there. Maybe some of the Raiders or a couple of the Raiders or whoever. And also the pictures would be incorporated, traditional party pictures. Well, we went into our record company to get that all cleared legally. And they said, there's no way you're going to do that unless they agree to do the same. We said, well, we don't want to do a party album. We just don't want to do everything they do. When we come up with a concept where we can use them, we'll let you know. They said, well, we got to have it in writing. We said, no, wait a minute. We don't have them pinned down. They're just not going to sign an open agreement that they're going to do whatever we ask them to do. We don't have a concept yet. Well, then make one up. We can't make one up yet. Just take our word for it. We're all ethical. We believe in them. They believe in us. And we work fine. And don't get in the middle of it. Just let us do it. No, you can't do it. Matter of fact, now that we know that you're going to do it, we're going to watch closely and see if you do it. If you do it, we're going to hold up your royalties. So Jan said, oh, well, when it came to royalties, that made all the difference in the world. Well, in that case, so Jan said, well, I'm not going to do it. You know, and well, I'll explain it to Brian why we can't do it. I said, well, if I feel like doing it, I'm going to do it. Jan said, you better not. I said, well, they won't hold up your royalties, so just hold up mine. I don't care. I'm living at home. I have no overhead. So I went to the party, part of the party, which was down at Mike Love's house. And I was in some of the pictures playing volleyball, and they cut me out except for my arm in one shot. And then when it came to recording, we were in the studio one night. We were like in Studio A, and they were always in Studio B, or vice versa. And Jan was trying to put on a lead to a song that he wrote that I thought was one of the all-time worst songs that I'd ever heard. So I said, well, you finish your lead, and I don't feel like listening to this song, so I'm going to go down and see what the Beach Boys are doing. He said, well, don't sing. And I said, oh, don't worry. I won't sing. And I go down, and I open up the door and walk in, and within 2 minutes, we're doing Barbara Ann. When I walked in, somebody asked me, I think it was Mike, said, hey, Dean, okay, let's do a song. So I said, well, what have you done so far? And he said, so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. They said, what do you want to sing? I said, how about Barbara Ann? And we'd done it on an album about a year before, but never really did it as well as it could have been done. And I don't know why I said Barbara Ann. I have no idea. Just said, let's do Barbara Ann. So I said, okay. And on the album, we started out a couple of times and changed the key because it was either too high or too low. I don't remember. Then finally sang the song as best as we could all the way through, and it must have been one take. Just that quick. And on the end, Carl said, thank you, Dean. I said, well, thank you, guys. Goodbye. And I walked out. Walked back and went to our session, where Jan was still working on maybe the first 3 bars of the first verse. And I'd gone down and cut a #1 record, you know. I mean, a huge, all-time selling #1 record in about 3 minutes. He came back and he was still working on this thing, which never even was released. Some sort of message there, and I still haven't found out what it is.
The record that's so reminiscent of all mid-60s parties, and as Dean Torrance said, another worldwide hit for the Beach Boys. So, with the breathing space gained by the release of the Simply Produced Party album, Brian and the group were able to give time and concentration to a more complex form of production. The concentration was mostly Brian's as the group continued to tour. As for the time, well, Carl isn't too sure how long the whole project took.
It could have been close to a year. The thing is that it was just sort of unfolded, you know. It wasn't a conscious thing until after Brian really got into it. Then he got a hold of a direction, you know, he got a hold of a concept and he went with it, you know. I think Sloop John B was the first track. Alan had the idea to do that particular song. And just coincidentally, Brian was just really unfolding at that time and really evolving musically, so he did up a really, that's a pretty unique arrangement for that tune, you know, for a folk song, you know, to come across with the strength that it did.
We come on.
Sloop John B was released as a single in March of 1966, a couple of months before the Pet Sounds album, and in many ways it forms a link between their last studio recorded albums, Summer Days and Summer Nights, and Pet Sounds itself. There's a similarity, for instance, to Phil Spector's song Then He Kissed Me, which is on Summer Days, but the overall sound of both voices and backing is somehow richer. When one talks of a concept album, the strength of the term ought really to be defined. It's possible to make out a case for some of the Beach Boys' earlier albums to be regarded as concepts, if you consider that only implies similarity of subject matter in the songs. Thus, albums like Surfing USA and Surfer Girl were obviously mostly about surfing, while Shut Down Volume 2 and Little Deuce Coupe were about hot rodding. But the point is that nobody actually sat down and worked out what the overall shape and feel of the albums would be before they were produced. They were just a collection of songs they recorded as they went along. As Carl suggested just now, once Brian had found the direction he wanted to take with Pet Sounds, he was very sure of what he wanted to do. His wife Marilyn remembers this well.
Oh yeah, he said to me one night, he said, Mare, I'm going to write, and I'm going to make the greatest rock album. That's when, you know, things were starting to get a little bit heavier. And he just said, I'm going to do the greatest album. And he did it. I remember when the album was completely finished, and he brought home the demo disc of the album. And we just, you know, laid down on the bed and just listened. It was like heaven. I mean, he was so proud. It was really a beautiful experience, because to hear everything that he had in his mind, and believe me, what he has in his mind, nobody will ever know. But to hear it right there, you just, oh boy, he was so proud of it.
I can hear so much.
Well, as I said, the group had continued to tour, certainly during the embryonic stages of the album anyway. Dean Torrance.
I thought they had one of the perfect setups I'd ever seen, and that they had the producers sitting at home, coming up with the great songs, writing the songs, arranging, cutting the tracks, and sometimes waiting for them to get home, and sometimes not. So your music's being cut, and the group is out on the road promoting. So you're doing two things at once. And hopefully you do them both well, and at the time they were doing both very well.
Al Jardine.
When we were in Japan, he put Pet Sounds together. And then we came back and did all the overdubs and all the vocalizing. he basically put the tracks together for that album. So had he been on tour with us, I don't know if it would have been done at all.
And Carl Wilson.
Now, that was the beginning of '66. When we were in Japan, I'd call up and Brian would do a track that he'd done to record it. And, you know, it's a funny... Good Vibration should have been on that record. And, you know, I don't know why it wasn't. I think that it could have been just trying to hold it for a single, you know, and not put it out on the album. It could have been something, some idea like that.
The other thing that interests me, Carl, about the album, had you consciously tried things out on previous albums leading up to Pet Sounds?
Oh, well, Brian would just say, I want to try this, or do, you know, he'd just get an idea, you know, and that would be it. As far as the songs, they came out very spontaneously. As far as writing melodies and making up tunes, it was like it was almost automatic, really. You know, he made up some really nice songs, and just, God only knows, I think came out in 5 minutes, you know, just came right through. And that was a special tune for us, too. That and You Still Believe in Me. You Still Believe in Me was really easy. That one just sang itself, you know, it was like really, it happened naturally.
So Brian had set out to write and produce something really special. But did the rest of the group realise this when they were actually working on the album? Dennis Wilson.
I knew it was. I'd never heard anything quite like that before. I mean, I've heard, you know, pieces that were involved and pretty much intertwined melody-wise. A lot of the weaving of melodies, you know, but I never experienced actually doing it, performing it, you know. So I knew by doing it that it was special.
Oh, Jardine.
Well, really, I mean, it was a whole new horizon for us. And Brian just introduced a whole new concept in music. Well, pop music. He put pop music in a very special place. And the group went through those changes. Because we were a surfing group when we left the country. You know, basically, and we came back to this new music. And it took some getting used to. It was a different kind of singing. So a more subtle approach to pop music. It wasn't just bashing out one tune after another. It took a lot of skill. And I learned a lot myself.
So how much time did first Brian and then the group spend on that album?
Brian knocked that out pretty quick, the tracks. But the vocals were another thing. Those were arduous, tedious, long hours. I think we spent about, at that time, this is a lot of money, $70,000 on Pet Sounds alone.
And Mike Love certainly remembers working hard on that album.
I don't know if we ever thought, well, this is really going to shake the world or anything, but we really worked our buns off on it, so to speak. And we knew the integrity of the music. We knew that we worked on the harmonies, and if there was the slightest little hint of a sharp or flat, it wouldn't go on. We'd do it over again until it was right. So I think we worked more than I've ever known anybody else to work, you know, in terms of trying to perfect. Not that I wanted to be that perfect. I always felt that, wow, I mean, you know, who's going to hear it but somebody with ears the pitch of a dog, you know, they can hear high, you know, whistles beyond the human ear, but Brian had those kind of ears, you know, so, okay, we'll do it another time, you know. And he was going for every subtle nuance that you could conceivably think of. Every voice had to be right. Every voice in its resonance and tonality had to be right. The timing had to be right. The timbre of the voices just had to be key-wrecked according to that time, how he felt. And then he might, the next day, completely throw that out and we might have to do it over again.
And Carl knew exactly what they were about.
We were really trying to make a good album. We wanted to take a step, you know. And the group definitely stretched on that one, you know, the group was doing something. Wouldn't It Be Nice, I think, is the tune that really brought that home to all of us. Because we did about, at least 10 sessions on it. And it just wasn't right. I'd still think that we sang a little rushed and the background part wasn't really laying into the rest of the track.
With an album as fresh and as innovative as this one, it was obviously necessary to have the full backing of the record company. But did the Beach Boys get it? Carl Wilson.
Capitol Records, I think they were a little bit afraid of it because they probably thought they'd lose a market or a segment of people, you know, I don't know. That's the way it was at the time. I think that they probably would think differently now.
And Bruce Johnston.
Maybe Capitol didn't see the evolution of the whole Beach Boys' 62 to 66 panorama. But this album was so radical compared to the really nice commercial Barbara Anns that we'd been making, that they'd been so successful in selling, that they just wanted more. So instead of promoting Pet Sounds here in America, even though we had Wouldn't It Be Nice and God Only Knows and Sloop John B out of that album become successful singles, they turned around and put out the first Best of the Beach Boys and promoted that. And it went gold quickly. And they didn't promote Pet Sounds because they said that it wasn't commercial and that people wouldn't understand it. And we were making our big gamble of kind of growing up in music, and Capitol just... I mean, I don't dislike anybody at Capitol, but they just didn't think that this was the direction we should take, so they didn't promote it.
The Vice President of Promotion for Capitol Records, Al Corey.
Well, I'll tell you something. I think that Capitol, as a record company, which consisted of many people, you know, many promotion people and sales people, which is a record company, some of the people were very, you know, carried away with the album and felt like it was an important album. Other people probably couldn't relate to it, because I really think that the album was probably ahead of its time. I think that most people today realize that it was. I remember one thing. I remember that the album did receive good exposure at the time, but yet it didn't sell. The retail activity on the LP was not as good as previously released Beach Boy albums.
I know there's an answer. Well, being the shrewd person that he is, Bruce Johnston had already decided that the record would need all the help it could get, and that he could give it.
I felt that I really should go all out for the group, because I knew the music was getting complicated, and it was going to be a little harder to have people digest it. I saw Brian progressing, and I thought, uh-oh, well, we've got these commercial songs like Sloop John B and California Girls and Barbara Ann that we've put out, but now he's getting in the Pet Sounds. Well, I can remember what happened to Phil Spector with that Ike and Tina. River Deep Mountain High didn't go down here at all. But I thought, well, if Brian's going to kind of get into things like that, I better get out there and make sure the Beach Boys have some kind of a look about them, some kind of a public look. So what I did was, after a tour in April of 1966, Barbara Ann had already been #1 here in the States. We had just come back from Japan, then we made Pet Sounds in February and March, and Capitol had just put it out here in the States. And so I got on a plane, and I went to England in May, and I stayed at a hotel called the Waldorf. And I got a suite so I could have a drawing room so I could see people, and I had a couple English friends of mine set up interviews, because I thought, well, I better start promoting now for when we come over in November. And I don't know if I did a good job or not, but I do know that I caused EMI to put Pet Sounds out 3 or 4 months earlier than they'd planned. And that was my first English trip. In fact, the last night I was in London, Lennon and McCartney came over with Keith Moon one night to listen to the album, Pet Sounds album. I think they liked it.
Another visitor to the hotel was Tony Rivers.
Bruce makes his big entrance. He came in wearing a white suit and white shirt and white tie and white shoes. God, it's like the Homo Man coming in, you know. And he was really made it, and he's all brown and handsome, and I thought, Jesus Christ, you know, this is really how the Beach Boys, I think everybody who knew the Beach Boys felt that way. That's what they were, the all-American boys with the short hair and the good, clean image, and this was it, you know, Bruce is your actual all-American boy. But, you know, the appearance was a bit deceptive because he was quite earthy, really. Anyway, he had their new album, Pet Sounds, because I went green when I heard that he got it. And he said, how would you like me to play it for you? And he gave me a preview of it. And he suggested a number from it that I should record with the group. I thought, this is a good idea, maybe. Because we really weren't the Beach Boys. It seemed like a good idea at the time, which is a good title for an album. And so he suggested God Only Knows. And I, you know, played the track again, and I thought, yeah, it's a great song. There again, it's so different, and it's so well produced. Oh, the production slayed me. And he gave us an album, you know, and I took it away and played it to the rest of the boys, you know, and we all said, yeah, sure. So I went into his small studio and did a rough demo of it. see how it came out. And we were in there recording it, and by a complete surprise, Terry Melcher walked in. And we knew Terry Melcher from things like the Rip Chords. And he suddenly said, I was on that. What? He said, sure, I'm on one of those voices at the end. Because this was new to us as well. We just thought it was the Beach Boys, but apparently they used loads of different people at the end, coming in all the counterpoint harmonies at the end. Anyway, he liked the way we were doing it. So we recorded it properly. That was my first production, actually. And we made it more up-tempo than their way. And in the end, we should really never have done it, because we were on EMI, the Beach Boys were on EMI. I mean, we'd been suggested this song by Bruce Johnson, so it would seem fair enough if the boys themselves said, do it, then we were going to do it. Anyway, we did it. EMI suddenly got a cable from the States saying, Capitol Records wish to release God Only Knows by the Beach Boys. Well, EMI told us. We were a bit shattered, but we said, OK, well, don't release our one then. And they said, oh no, we think we're going to release your one still. And we went, don't be silly, you know, how can you release our one with the Beach Boys? Bring it out themselves. And they said, no, we'll bring yours out a week earlier. And we thought, oh great, that's great planning, you know, bring it out a week earlier, we'll scoop 100,000 before the Beach Boys, will we? Oh, silly company, you know. Anyway, in the end, the Beach Boys one was released on the same day as our one, and we actually made the top 50, which was, for us, was pretty good going, because we never knew what the top 50 was, really, and we got in about 48 for about 10 minutes, I think it was, you know, and it disappeared rapidly. We met Bruce Johnson a while after that, when they came over, and he was full of apologies, saying, you know, it really wasn't their fault, because he'd realised that he'd suggested that we do it, and there we were, you know, right in the middle of a problem, with the Beach Boys sitting with a great record. The feel on theirs, I mean, was, we didn't go for feel then, you weren't into that, we were just trying to get a commercial record to get into the charts, you know. We did it in our own style, but unfortunately we were slightly outweighed by the opposition, I feel. Only slightly.
As Tony Rivers said just now, they were with the same company as the Beach Boys in England, which was EMI. And so were the Rob Storm Group, who covered another number from Pet Sounds, Here Today, and made a pretty good job of it too. Not much problem for the Beach Boys, of course, but there was another group with the same company in Britain and in America, called the Beatles. Could it perhaps be that it was just too much for one company to handle two such groups effectively? And did the arrival of Pet Sounds only serve to pave the way for Sgt. Pepper a year later? Al Curry of Capitol Records.
I tend to doubt that, only because I think when the Beatles hit, shortly after I Want to Hold Your Hand, and the other follow-up, you know, records they had, and then their albums, and then their television appearances, there was a certain magic about the Beatles that you couldn't compare to the Beach Boys. I think in those days that the Beatles, when they finally put out Sgt. Pepper, their masterpiece, that it all built up to that. In the case of the Beach Boys, it didn't build up to Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds maybe came 4 or 5 albums too soon for them, you know? I don't think that Pet Sounds, as far as Capitol personnel were concerned, helped Sgt. Pepper. I think Sgt. Pepper would have been as bigger album that it was with or without Pet Sounds. And I think it had no bearing whatsoever. Both those albums did an awful lot, because even in the case of Pet Sounds, where it wasn't one of their all-time bestsellers as far as the consumers was concerned, rock groups that became an immediate favorite of all the rock groups, the up-and-coming rock groups and even the more established rock groups. So I think that album, Pet Sounds, did have a fantastic effect on the business or the future of rock music, you know, even though, like I said before, it wasn't already an overwhelming sales success, you know. But I must tell you that, looking back at it, nobody should be ashamed of the sales, because it did have very respectable sales. I would say that the last that we looked at those figures many years ago, it was well over 500,000 units.
In fact, the sales for the album will now be much higher, as the album's been repackaged by Brother Records in America and released through the group's present company, Warner Brothers, and sold as a 2-album set with Carl and the Passions' So Tough. One interesting point with this version, though, is that it's only available in mono. In fact, it says on the sleeve, this recording is pressed in monophonic sound, the way Brian cut it. Carl Wilson.
Yeah, it was a mono record. and the engineers at Capitol, I don't know what you call it. I think they called it duophonic. And it was a thing they did with the EQ, and they amplified different frequencies on the opposite sides to make a stereo sound, in that some frequencies, maybe some of the mid-range and the very top end will come out one side, and then the low end and the vocal range would come out on the other side. It was to give definition to those parts and make it sound stereo. But it was really mono. But that was a very complete record, so it sounded like stereo because of the arrangements. They flowed in such a way that musically it was like what the other people were doing in stereo with sound effects.
I had to prove that I could make it alone now, but that's not. I soon found out that my lonely life.
With the passing of years since its release, the group can now afford to look at the album with some degree of detachment, but justifiably they're still very proud of it. Mike Love.
Because of that hard work that we put into it and the musical content, I think it has proved itself, in spite of the fact that it had to overcome a little opposition to the record company and not really a lot of promotion. They just kind of put it out, but it kept building and building. Now it seems that it's a lot of people's favorite album.
Why the title Pet Sounds, Mike?
We were standing in the hallway in one of the recording studios, either Western or Columbia, and we didn't have a title. So we were thinking, maybe it's a double entendre. We had taken pictures at a zoo, and there were animals, and there was animal sounds on the record. We were thinking, well, it's our favorite music of that time, so why don't we call it Pet Sounds? I mean, it was that simple. I think it's a fitting title. It's a fun title, Pet Sounds.
A fun title, but an advanced album, and maybe this was really the problem. Perhaps it was too soon. Brian's wife, Marilyn, certainly thinks so.
Yeah, I don't think people were ready for it. No, I think it was just too much of a shock. But a lot of people who understood it, you know, really recognized the quality of it immediately.
How did people respond to it in California?
People in the industry just, they were going, at it. And the public, I don't think they took on to it quite as fast. Now they know. I think that everything that Brian put into it, the people really had to grow with it. And now, you know, when they hear it, they can just hear the special quality of it, because it really is a kind of like a timeless album. I think it'll just be a classic of its own forever.
I keep looking for a place to fit in.
A song which is so right in the context of the album. Well, there's little left to say, really, so I'll leave it to music critic Richard Williams to pay his tribute to Pet Sounds, followed by just a few words from Carl Wilson.
I think in retrospect Pet Sounds is a finer album than Sgt. Pepper, which overshadowed it, which I think is a great shame, and obviously put the Beach Boys back perhaps 2 or 3 years in the public eye anyway. And if Smile had come out, who knows what would have happened, because from what we know, Smile could well have turned out to be the greatest pop album of all time. I think Pet Sounds, for instance, is dated much less than Sgt. Pepper is dated. It sounds much more current.
Anyway, for us, it was the best we could do at the time, and we thought it was good for us.
I'd be without you.
As we've heard in previous programmes, the Beach Boys had had various disagreements with their record company over the years, and these were highlighted at the time of the release of Pet Sounds. Carl Wilson.
Capitol Records. There was a very nice man there named Carl Engelman, who is really the guy that we knew, you know, the man that we talked to there. The others we didn't really trust because we thought they were weird or phony or something. But he was pretty much with what Brian wanted to do, although he was responsible, you know, for a certain area of activity within Capitol Records, and he had to answer to people higher up, you know, than himself. They were just very resistant to going forward musically.
As was shown by the fact that they released the Best of the Beach Boys Volume 1 within a month of the release of Pet Sounds. The title of the album is self-explanatory, and although we've heard most of the songs already in this series of programmes, its release does give us the excuse to play a couple of numbers that we've missed so far. Do You Want to Dance and You're So Good to Me from the British version of the Best of the Beach Boys. And I make that distinction because the selections on the British and the American copies are different. And there are also 2 more tracks on the British version of both Volume 1 and Volume 2. Well, for once, British is best. Anyway, Bruce Johnston has pointed out that despite Capitol's hesitancy regarding Pet Sounds, a single was released featuring 2 of the songs from the album, Wouldn't It Be Nice and God Only Knows. That was released in August of 1966, and by October the next one was due. But how do you follow 2 such fine songs? Maybe Brian Wilson knew all along that he'd written a song that could follow just about anything. He got Carl to listen to the backing track in his customary manner.
Yeah, he played this weird thing on the phone, and it was Good Vibrations, and it was a really funky track. It was just more of a sort of let it rip, drums, you know, smashing and stuff. And then it sort of refined itself, and then he got into the cello, quarter note triplets, and that, and the theremin. Of course, the first time he used theremin was on Just Wasn't Made for These Times. And he just saw it in the studio and said, what is that? And the guy who was playing trombone on the session said, oh, that's a theremin. He played it for him, and so they used it, and then he really liked it.
The theremin is the device that makes the whistling sounds on the 2 tunes that Carl mentioned, and it's a sort of sophisticated tone generator. Anyway, the music track was written, so what about the lyrics? Here's Mike Love.
I wrote the lyrics to Good Vibrations on the way down the Hollywood freeway about 10 minutes before the session one night. And it was a unique experience. I was dictating the words as we were driving down the freeway. It's kind of amazing. It's kind of one of those cliffhangers. We need some words. Okay, let's see.
I love the colorful clothes you wear.
Another number 1 for the Beach Boys, their first million-selling single in the USA, and certainly amongst the top 5 singles of the 1960s. Like the Pet Sounds album, Good Vibrations was particularly well received in England.
I have to compliment the English for their total acceptance of Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations. That was the only saving grace. You know, I don't know why. I guess they're just more sophisticated in their musical taste. That's all I can think of. You know, it's a compliment.
And a gratifying one, too, from Al Jardine. The group decided to capitalise on their record successes in Britain and undertake their first playing tour in November of that year. The promoter was Arthur Howes.
It was one of those things which came to us through the good offices, really, of a person called Dick Duryea, and who was looking after them at that time. They topped the bill because they were very, very popular here. It was all in the Beatles era, and as far as American groups were concerned, I think they were the top American act. Complete sellout everywhere they went, and it was all the Scream era, and they got it all.
It was a sort of feeler tour of 8 theatres, 2 shows a night, and the timing was perfect. For when they opened at the Finsbury Park Astoria on that first night, the Good Vibrations single was already number 2 in the charts. Their publicity man in England for that tour was Roger Easterby.
Basically because at that time I was working for Arthur Howes, and it was natural that, you know, I would get totally involved with them as an act, and of course I spent most of the time with them during that period on their own private aircraft and things like that. But they were a very promotion-conscious group, which was amazing because I don't think anybody realised until they actually came over here just how big they were, and it was surprising to see this sort of fan worship they had. But of course they were a very professionally organised group as well. That, I think, was an insight to me, having worked with British groups and seeing how things were thrown together, to see even down to the last detail. It was very much like relating it over here to a football team where they were in the dressing room and they would have a team talk. This would happen with the Beach Boys. production manager would say to them, "Now tonight, fellas, you've got 45 seconds to come off stage," and he would really ruck them if they were longer than that. He said, "Look, fellas, it took you 49 seconds to get off stage tonight, and I told you you've got to get off in 45." And this was, you know, really amazing, the fact that when they changed into their, you know, what I relate as their Sheffield Wednesday shirts, remember the blue and white shirts, which they wore to this time, it was a uniform, and they, you know, it was like rubbing down with white horse oils. They would all change at immediately the same time. The whole thing was such a professional operation. I'm sure it rubbed off on a lot of British acts later on. I think it opened a lot of people's eyes to how businesslike these guys were. I mean, off stage, like anybody else, they were looners, and they used to separate and have a great time. We did one of the theatres at Manchester. That was an incident where we had to get Mike Love through. The others had gone on ahead, but Mike was finishing a meal at the hotel, and we had to think of a way of getting him into the theatre. And in fact, what we did, there was a news cellar down the road, and we borrowed his cloth cap. He wore the typical North of England cloth caps, and we put a muffler around Mike, and we put this cloth cap on him, and we walked in with the crowd, and we walked down the centre aisle, and we used the exit under the stage. That was the very first thing at Manchester. That's why that one sticks vividly in my mind. The fan following was just absolutely amazing. The girls, you know, just would do anything to get into the dressing room, and you know, to get them out of theatres was just an amazing scene. You had to think of new ideas all the time. I think, you know, once we got into a car and there were 3 girls on the floor of the car who actually got in, whether they'd bribed the driver or not, I don't know, but they were in the car waiting, you know. I think they enjoyed the ride.
It starts with just a little glance now, right away you
So the concerts were very successful, but meanwhile back in California, Brian had undertaken the task of writing and producing their next album.
As a producer, I really think the only place for an artist to go is further. And I think Brian finally reached a point there where I thought he was free, that he would do things that he wasn't strapped into, he hadn't done in the past. And I thought this is some sort of freedom that he's gotten within himself, which will be marvelous if he continues it. And somewhere along the line, Brian got boxed in again. I thought the catalyst of the reason was that he had made such a different and such a far-out album for that period and for that group. I think he's scared of himself. And he went back into the box. And I think because he was by himself, he just freaked out. So I think he ran to Van Dyke Parks because there was some sort of security, like everybody's told me he's right and he's good. So I know my work can't be bad then because I'll be working with him. What Brian, I think, failed to see was he was just brilliant and he was fine. He was afraid to be great by himself in case he wasn't great. He thought it'd be easier to fail with a partner, you know. And I think that was still good for him, you know, working with Van Dyke Parks. But I don't think that was Brian, because now we're only getting half of Brian. We still have another influence in his music. The objective viewpoint is good, but he didn't need a partner, you see. It was like he kept putting up obstacles to himself.
Well, whilst not necessarily agreeing with all the sentiments expressed there by record producer Nick Venet, it is true to say that Van Dyke Parks was probably the strongest personality outside the group that Brian had yet been involved with. Previously, Brian had co-written some of his songs with Mike Love or other songwriters such as Gary Usher and Jan Berry, disc jockey Roger Christian, and most recently on Pet Sounds with advertising man Tony Asher. Here's Marilyn Wilson.
Brian, you know, he enjoyed that. He really doesn't like to work alone as far as, like, writing. But Tony, he came up with some good lyrics and ideas with Brian. I think the ideas were all Brian's, but these people collaborated with lyrics. So he worked with him on Pet Sounds, a lot of the songs, and then we never saw him again. They come and they go. No, he was good. He was. If he wasn't good, Brian wouldn't have been with him.
Well, no, he wasn't. He was with Van Dyke Parks, and anyone who's met him will testify to the fact that he has a flow of ideas, an agility of mind, and a flexibility of speech that can leave you breathless just listening to him. Fortunately, some of his requests are easily granted.
Can I have some celery? Listen. They found Ewell Gibbons recently starving to death, surrounded by 45 acres of celery. This is what we call monoculture in the United States. I go to a supermarket to get that kind of news. Thank God this hotel has celery. So it's about the Beach Boys.
Well, we will do that. We will. One of the songs they recorded at the time was written by Van with Brian Wilson and was simply called Vegetables. Marilyn Wilson again.
That was a great song.
Yeah.
I remember on that song, when they were doing the vocals on it, Paul McCartney had come in town that day, and Brian had met him before, and I guess Paul, wanted to meet with Brian and the guys again. And so he came over to the studio there, and I don't know who got all the vegetables, but Brian wanted carrots and celery. And when they were doing that, they were actually chomping on vegetables. And Paul came in the studio, and he didn't know what was happening. And Brian's sitting there, at the board, mixing down certain vocals, and he's taking the celery stick, and he takes this big thing of salt and just throws it on the table there, here in the middle of the studio, and starts taking the celery stick like this. And Paul looks at him ooh, what is happening? And all of a sudden he picks up a celery stick and does the same thing. It was really funny. But Brian was really into vegetables then.
I'm gonna be around my vegetables. I'm gonna chop down.
Well, to hear his version of how the association with Brian began, developed and finished, as well as a few other tales along the way, I'll leave you for a few minutes with the thoughts of Van Dyke Parks.
I met him on the lawn of Terry Melcher's house, Doris Day's son, for whom I have the greatest respect, and who's coming out with an album of his own. Those were the days of considerable drug abuse, not among us, but surrounding us. The individuality of each man was tested during the group grope that occurred in 1966 when I met Brian Wilson on Terry Melcher's lawn. Brian said, come on up and listen to some sounds. I went up to his house. He had a 4-track, he had an 8-track, whatever machinery he had. And an artist he was, deserving of this equipment that impressed me, along with the steaming swimming pool at Brian's house, which on that mountaintop in the Hollywood Hills was an example of the energy expanse, the avarice or apparent avarice of what Hollywood represents. Brian Wilson and I then went into collaboration at his house between the swimming pool operations and my jumping through his sandbox to his Steinway piano. Brian did all the music, all of it. He was the central source of what we call ideas today when we talk about copyright. Brian was the only person I knew, and I worked for the Beach Boys in 1966, and by 1967 I was fired because it was already decided quickly by Mike Love as well, down to the least known members, that I had written some words which were indecipherable and unnecessary. In short, they had had a better lyricist on Pet Sounds than they had on what is now called Smiley Smile. Smile, the album that was to have come out, which was Proof of Pudding, which took place during a transference of a tremendous amount of litigation. Show business is the most litigious business in the world. It is only second to the legitimate sale of drugs in terms of cash flow worldwide. That's why $1 a record makes sense to an American dollar consciousness. There are no interest rates, there's no paper deals like movies. Records are the name of the game, as Groucho Marx said to me the other day. They'll spend their last buck on entertainment. So where does that leave me?
Talk about Smile more, Van Dyke. How much time you spent working on that?
We spent easily, after Pet Sounds, which is my favorite Beach Boy album, in Smile, the recording, the studio experience itself became more emphatically and demonstrably and persuasively dominant over the way a performance would take place in a proscenium. Great story. For example, Good Vibrations. The cello, The man played triplets. He played the fundamental to the chords. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And he played, this is Jesse Ehrlich. He came in and played the cello, see, to make it right. Now, I couldn't play cello. I said, Arco, Brian. He went into the talkback from the control booth, the first string player that he had ever assailed of such veteran ability. He said, Barco. The man played good vibrations. Sound, the studio sensation was no longer the performance. Something tremendously individual happened that only improved the value of the group to enforce it in performance. I have a feeling that good vibrations is what guides me. I wrote Heroes and Villains with Brian. He said da 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 da. Immutable. I put a sentence on that because I worked for Brian, not with. He was it. I've been in this town so long that back in the city I've been taken for lost and gone, unknown for a long, long time. Fell in love with an innocent girl. Okay, you know, I forget the lyrics. It was a great tune.
I've been in this town so long that back in the city I've been taken for a long.
Heroes and Villains, released as a single and as a track on the album Smiley Smile. But if by this time you're a little confused as to where Smile ended and Smiley Smile began, don't worry, because so is Brian's wife, Marilyn.
You know, to this day, I do not know what Smile consists of. To me, Smile is just a lot of things that they've already put into other songs. You know, I mean, really. One thing about when Brian writes, if he writes something, he may take and put 3 different riffs or ideas from one song he's writing into another song. I mean, it's just so confusing. He knows what it's all about. I don't. The only thing I can think of is the Fire song, which was just, there were never any words put to it. But I don't know what else they intended to put in there.
The Fire song that Marilyn referred to was a piece of music often known as Mrs. O'Leary's Cow, but always referred to as Fire and written as a part of a suite entitled The Elements. On the day of the session, Brian sent Marilyn scurrying about Los Angeles to collect as many firemen's helmets as she could for the session musicians to wear. Brian thought it would help the musicians get the right feel for the music. Anyway, back to Van Dyke Parks.
The way he treats string players is with a, I don't know. I mean, that is, don't get me hung up in your qualifications and your lingo and your lexicon and your terminal dynastic scholarly interests. String players. I don't care if you are the first violinist of the L.A. Philharmonic or just a Sharpie. Play the notes. And Brian, to prove himself, went out one day. What a bodacious spirit, what enterprise, what Yankee ingenuity came from Brian Wilson when he presented in 2 hours' time those string parts that mystified people on the issue of fire. Fire didn't come out because it was burning down too many buildings. The string section was just sliding all over the place, and it was Brian's notation without a copyist that provided that ensemble response.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but it is true that there were coincidentally several major fires in the Los Angeles area just after the work was recorded. It isn't true, however, that the tapes of that or any of the other sessions were ever destroyed. The reason for their non-release, Al Jardine attributes to Brian's disappointment with the acceptance of Pet Sounds in America.
The acceptance on the album was so late in coming that by that time he just decided the game was over. He just decided what's the point, you know, and putting anything into it. And he never really did, I don't think, recover from that, you know. He just decided that maybe he'd wait for a while until the industry caught up or something, I don't know. We spent as much time on that album as we did on Pet Sounds. It's not far from completion. That could be completed if he wanted to put the energy into it. I don't think I'd attempt to do it because it's not my work, you know. I mean, I could finish it. I think Carl and I and Dennis could probably, and Mike could probably put it together, but I'd rather he did it, you know. It's in fragments. It's just a bunch of fragments, and they're really good. They're really superb fragments.
In fact, 3 of the songs originally intended for the Smile album have already appeared on subsequent albums, but in different forms from the way they were originally recorded. The songs are Cabernescence on 2020, Cool Water on Sunflower, and of course Surf's Up on the album of the same title. And we'll be hearing those as we get to the respective albums. Anyway, the next record release after Smiley Smile was the single that was to become the title track of the following album, Wild Honey. The whole of the Wild Honey album was recorded in Brian's home because, as well as having a grand piano in a sandbox, as Van Dyke Parks mentioned earlier, it now had one room converted into a recording studio. He was now becoming both physically and spiritually more insulated from the outside world. In May of that year, though, promoter Arthur Howes had brought the rest of the group back to Britain for their second playing tour.
Just to prove what a professional type group they are and how much they think of their fans, there was a time when Carl was having a little problem with his passport, and we were opening up on the Friday night, I think it was, in Belfast, the Adelphi Belfast. And that same day, he still hadn't got a passport, and he got his passport about 12 hours before the curtain was due up in Belfast. He dashed out and hired a Learjet to bring him personally to the opening night. And he got there just in time for the curtain up in the concert.
The reason Carl had no passport was because it had been withdrawn when the FBI arrested him. He'd previously received his draft papers for the United States Services.
I got a notice to report for physical, and it was just one of those things that I never got around to thinking about or making a move on, because I just never came up, you know. And it came up. And so I thought, okay, now what is my position on this? And I just applied for conscientious objector on religious grounds. We were in court many times over about a 6-year period. And it really showed me a really weird thing, because I spent quite a lot of money on the thing, and somebody in a less fortunate position would have really been in trouble, you know. And that was a very strange experience to go through. But in the end, the judge was very fair, and he gave me a chance to do the alternate service that I said I would do, you know, something in line with what, you know, I knew how to do. Most of the thing ended up in the voter registration effort that we did. You know, we registered quite a lot of people. So everything, you know, ended well. But the technical and legal thing was amazing, you know. And it got to right down to the very last appeal, the very last day, the judge cooled out, and it worked, you know. But I was convicted by a jury for failing to report for alternate service at the LA County General Hospital, right? And it's true, I failed to report, you know.
What actually happens then, Carl? If you say no, they propose that you...
Well, it depends. If you've got the muscle, you know, legally, you know, and you could go into court and fight it, then you can stay in. But if you don't, you're just off to the pokey, you know.
But fortunately, Carl's sojourn at the Pokey was a brief one, and he was soon on his way to Britain for the tour. Just as well, too, for as Roger Easterby says, Arthur Howes was more than keen to have them back again.
Well, yes, I mean, anybody who makes money you want back. I mean, you know, he would have kept them over here permanent residents, I'm sure. And every theatre was a sellout, and, you know, there were the fans screaming backstage. In fact, very much like today you get with the Osmonds. I mean, that thing was very much to do with the Beach Boys all those years ago. I mean, they really only had to go on stage and do their hits, and that was all the public wanted, and it was so programmed, and the timing was superb.
Successful tour for the group in Britain. Meanwhile, in America, a committee which included, amongst others, Paul McCartney, Andrew Oldham, Paul Simon, Derek Taylor, Terry Melcher, Lou Adler and Brian Wilson were making plans to launch a 3-day international festival of pop to be held in late June in Monterey, California. The performers not only had to agree to appear for free, but collectively had to provide $100,000 to finance the festival. Any gate receipts over that were to be used for financing music scholarships and non-establishment youth projects. Derek Taylor had been handling publicity for the Beach Boys in America since the time of Pet Sounds, so with him and Brian on the organising committee for the festival, it was no surprise that amongst the impressive list of artists booked to appear were the Beach Boys themselves. So what happened?
They dropped out. I forgive them because I'm not God, and not for me really to forgive them. And they shouldn't have dropped out. They were supposed to headline Saturday night. Tough 2 days that was. I mean, it was really tough. I couldn't believe it. Nobody could believe it. Lou Adler said, "What? What?" I said, "They won't do it." He said, "What do you mean they won't do it? Everyone's doing it. Otis is doing it. Simon's doing it. John's doing it. They're all doing it." I said, "They won't do it." And they didn't do it.
Why not?
I don't know. Cold feet, Brian or something, I don't know. But it was Brian's yes to me. But it got so hellish at the end that I can't remember where the no came from. I think probably Brian again. Came by proxy. I think maybe he shouldn't have said yes. Do you know what I mean? I don't think it was ever on. And then they took too long saying no. And the festival was the poorer without them, but it was so marvellous anyway that in the end it didn't matter. But it would have been better with them because they were representative of very good music. I think everyone profited from that festival so much. It was such a turning point, but it would have helped them, yeah. Who knows what would have happened. In the event, they're doing okay. At the time, the feeling on Sunday night when the whole thing was over was okay without them. But still a shame.
It was a great shame, but what effect did it have on the group's future career in America? Here's Mike Love.
Well, I always think that a main reason why we, other than the problems with the record company and them not promoting us in the way that we should have been promoted as an evolutionary, changing group, other than that, I always point to the fact that we didn't get on that Monterey Pop Festival, from which festival a lot of superstars were made. Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Otis Redding, Grateful Dead, or Jefferson Airplane.
What was the reason for you not doing that?
Well, there were a lot of reasons. Carl Wilson had just been arrested by the FBI and was going through that. Dennis Wilson was going through some personal hassles himself, and I guess I was ready to go. Bruce was packed. Brian was on the board of directors of the organization that was going to sponsor it, and then Brian got sort of cold feet on the situation because he didn't really trust that the people there on that organization were going to do right with the money and everything. Sure enough, there was a scandal about that about a year or two after they'd done the show, and sure enough, not too many people were handed out scholarships and things, But a couple of people had some nice houses and things. So there was that, and I guess Brian, being very intuitive, just didn't feel it was too right. So there wasn't a total agreement in the group to do that show, so we didn't. But out of that show, that was when really all that, I term acid and grass and all that, the dope went media. Went mid-America. Before that, it was avant-garde a little bit. The hippies, the artists, everybody in the know, the little cliques and groups and musical groups and sort of heady groups were into it. But then it just went up, mid-America. So it was uncool to be too cherubic and surfy and all that, it was into a whole other bag, and you had to be laid back and cool and smoke it and everything else. So, I think that had a lot to do with our not being in that wave that swept over America at that time.
It's true to say that the Beach Boys' non-appearance at the Monterey Festival heralded a period where the group as a whole now suffered a loss of momentum. Mike Love again.
I think we had tasted enough glories, if you know what I mean, like in terms of personal appearances and records, and we all had our material desires pretty well satisfied. We all bought our fancy homes and the swimming pools and had our Jaguars and Mercedes and Rolls Royces and things. So from that level, it was all satisfied. About December of '67, I remember meeting Maharishi in Paris, and of course he taught us how to do transcendental meditation. And so that appealed to me at the time. Ever since that time, I wanted to become a teacher. So I think the momentum of the group, if there was a momentum at that time, it wasn't the momentum of being a success and personal appearances and top 10 records as much as it was evolving in our music and as human beings, you know, as individuals, and the music as well. And I think it was like, you know, when Excalibur, the sword, was forged, it must have been heated and then plunged into cold water. That just tempers the blade. And I think what those years of 67, 68, and 69 did is it cleared the decks for us. It tempered us as musicians. It made us become more serious musicians and not just get by and rely upon the overwhelming popularity that we had in the U.S. And of course abroad in several places. But it really got us to think about developing ourselves and our music more.
How did you get involved in transcendental meditation, Mike?
Oh, well, we were invited to a United Nations Children's Emergency Fund, you know, UNICEF, and we were invited to go to Paris in December of '67. And I had heard about TM, Transcendental Meditation, before that, and I'd gone to a lecture, and I was kind of tired, and I kind of dozed throughout. So we went home, and we didn't actually start in L.A. We flew to Paris. We did this UN show with Victor Borga and Lena Horne and Marlon Brando and his Tahitian dancers and Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton and Ravi Shankar and the Red Army Choir and the Turkish Ballet. It was just a monumental show. It had, you know, about 4 or 6 French singers that were real famous in France, but I barely heard of, you know, that kind of thing. And just a beautiful show. And we were the only rock group on the show. And it so happened that George and John, you know, I bet you know who I mean. The boys, you know, the Liverpool lads, you know. The lads were there because they were at that time intrigued by Maharishi's practice of transcendental meditation, and they were learning from him at the time. So we met Maharishi right there in the hall during rehearsals, and it was kind of a funny story. We'd met him and talked to him. What do you think about astrology? We asked him all kinds of irrelevant questions. He says, oh, astrology's, we recognize that, but that's not what we're teaching. We're teaching this mental technique to give deep relaxation and increase the use of your conscious mind and all that. And so it was interesting meeting him, but we were busy and running here and there, and we left. After the show, we left and went back from Paris to England. When I say we, my wife and I and one of the fellows that worked for us, a roadie. And the other guys remained in Paris, but I loved England a lot. I really liked England. I've always have, and I preferred the English atmosphere, shall we say, to French, you know. Anyway, we came back, and I received a call. No sooner than I got into the hotel, I received a call from Dennis Wilson saying, hey, Mike, you got to come back to Paris. I said, what for? We just were there for a week. He said, well, Maharishi's going to teach us to meditate. And I said, you sure? And he says, I think so. I said, well, before I go flying back across the channel, make sure, you know. So, sure enough, he calls back in about a half an hour and says, yep, Maharishi's going to teach us at 10 o'clock in the morning. Be here. And he says, but you have to get to sleep early because you're supposed to get a lot of rest, you know. You're supposed to bring a few things. And so we went to bed at 8 o'clock at night and got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, flew back across the channel, landed, got in the cab. The cab driver turns around and says, you ever been to Paris before? And he said, yes. He said, when? Yesterday? Look at us crazy touristas, you know. So it was real fun. We went to the hotel, and Maharishi gave us this, what is equivalent to an introductory lecture. And then in the afternoon we came back and he gave us another little talk, and then he taught us the technique of transcendental meditation. It was the most relaxed I've ever been in my life. It was very relaxed, and it was very simple to do. And I just remember thinking very clearly that this thing is so simple that if everybody could do it, because it is so simple, everybody could do it, and if everybody did it, it would be just a totally different world, just based on the relaxation alone. Forget the mental development. Just if everybody were more relaxed, it would be a totally different situation in the world. So from the very first time I meditated, I was very intrigued about TM, and just a couple months later I found myself in India.
Transcendental meditation.
Whilst the influence of transcendental meditation was certainly to provide the group with a good deal of spiritual calm in the years to come, the more immediate future was to prove that their involvement with TM and with the Maharishi would have some quite disastrous results. In the last programme, we heard about the various trials and tribulations Brian Wilson encountered during the recording of the ill-fated Smile album. One of his closest friends during this period was David Anderley.
I became associated with Brian because his music was just killing me. I loved it. And all of a sudden there were like new elements in the Beach Boy life. A lot of the contacts I had made in the so-called underground here, I started bringing around to Brian. The press started paying attention, national press, underground press, all the people. He was getting phone calls from Paul McCartney and Andy Oldham. The mystique of Brian Wilson was growing. The tracks he had laid down, and this is when now I became really involved with the studio, because I'd go every night with Brian and just watch what was going on. And he cut the entire album, incredible tracks. They came back from England and listened to most of the tracks and didn't like what was going on. And during the course of this time also, I helped Brian start Brother Records and did that for a while.
Two interesting points were raised by David Anderley there. The first about the group not liking what they heard of the Smile tracks tends to underline what Van Dyke Park said previously. The group themselves don't seem to remember it that way now, but maybe they were influenced at the time by the overwhelming reaction at their concerts to the older material. After all, it was they and not Brian who were doing the touring, and perhaps there was a reluctance to go too far too fast. Anyway, the other point that David Anderley raised about the setting up of Brother Records is a more tangible one. The group had decided to form their own record company to gain greater artistic freedom and closer economic control, reasons which are very familiar nowadays, but at the time were quite new. This even predated the Beatles' Apple label. Initially, Capitol had consented and Smiley Smile appeared under the Brother Records banner. Unfortunately, it was in name only. Everything else was as before. And so by the next album, Wild Honey, they reverted to the official Capitol trademark until they could make some more permanent and effective change. We've already heard the title track of Wild Honey, but of course the other single that came off that album and carried them into 1968 was this one, called Darlin'. Darlin', written by Brian Wilson with lyrics by Mike Love, and there's no doubt that Mike preferred a fairly direct and obvious approach to lyric writing rather than the sometimes obscure word imagery employed by Van Dyke Parks.
Once he posed the question to me, over and over the crow cries, uncover the cornfield. What does that mean? I said, Mike, I don't know. I had written the words, see, and I was seeking the threshold for... Over and over the crow cries, uncover the cornfield. Jesus. So I said, Mike, I don't know. Soon I was fired, that is, I resigned. That is, I dissolved my relationship with the Beach Boys, and 7 years later they put out Surf's Up.
More like 5 years, actually, but in any case, the Beach Boys had become more self-reliant musically and more introspective as a group at the same time. Mike Love.
The turning point was that Smiley Smile. Going back then, that was a turning point philosophically. Instead of being all outward and expansive and big orchestrated tracks and everything. It went back to all introspective, very light, harmonious, personal kind of things. And then it moved on to Friends. And I was in India when Friends was being recorded, and I came back and did some things and contributed a couple of things, but it was just a whole... We've been friends now for so many years. We've been together through the good times and the tears. Turned each other on to the best things that life has to give. Well, it was just more of a personal kind of a thing and an introspective thing. So that time period was a turning point intellectually and emotionally and artistically, I think, for the group. It kind of cleared everything away, I think. Although we weren't selling out any, Madison Square Gardens then, so, from that point of view, we were in the background. But musically, I think we were just really developing. More individuals in the group began to write during that time. And, whereas before, Brian was doing most all the music, and now everybody can contribute musically. So I think it's a stronger group, actually.
We've been friends now for so many years.
Friends, and proving the point that Mike Love had just been making, that song was written collectively by Al Jardine, Brian, Dennis and Carl. Well, ever since the severance of the professional relationship with their father, Murray Wilson, the group had been without a personal manager. They did have various people working for them, however. Dick Durier performed the function of tour manager for the group through their American production company, and Nick Grillo had become their business manager in late 1966 at the group's request, after having previously handled their account for them at the company in which he had worked. So, in the spring of 1968, Dick Durier and Nick Grillo were about to set up a string of concert dates for the group. Nick Grillo.
At that time, we decided to promote our entire southern tour. It was in the spring, and we were preparing ourselves to play, I believe, 24 concerts in 22 cities. And the Beach Boys, of course, headlining the show, and the other acts consisted of Buffalo Springfield, the Soul Survivors, Strawberry Alarm Clock. The first date of that tour was in Nashville, Tennessee. When the boys arrived in Nashville, Dr. Martin Luther King was pronounced dead in Memphis, Tennessee, almost at the time that the boys deplaned. And about a month before, we were contemplating putting together a tour with Maharishi for the month of May, which would sort of follow the April tour, and we thought that both tours would be very successful financially. So we were simultaneously working on both tours. When the April tour became a disaster, a total disaster, because a lot of the dates couldn't be played because of martial law, a lot of the cities were being burned, it was a financial disaster. And we then tried to regroup and start to buttress up the May tour with the Maharishi. That May tour was quite a fiasco. At the time, Maharishi was in Europe, and I believe he was contemplating on doing some sort of a film for 4-star television, or possibly 4-star films, and he had already committed through his U.S. representative to do the tour with the boys. And again, we had, I forgot how many cities mapped out, major halls, and the boys would be on the show, and then the second half would consist of Maharishi lecturing and having a question and answer forum. The tour was delayed by about 2 days because he then had signed some sort of an agreement to continue on with the filming with 4-star, and it got to the point where we had to almost threaten litigation in order to have him acknowledge his responsibility to us, which he committed to sometime in the early part of 1968. I feel that a lot of people felt that the boys were trying to capitalize on something that the Beatles made popular, which was not the case at all. I think that they were very serious about transcendental meditation. But at that time, I think Maharishi was receiving a great deal of criticism in the U.S. press. So the tour really did not develop as well as we had anticipated. The entire problem came to a head back east. We were playing at a university. I think it was in New York State somewhere. It was on a Sunday. And the four-star people were at the concert, and we were trying to negotiate a way of having Maharishi continue on with our tour and at the same time fulfill his commitment to four-star. And we decided that rather than embark on the balance of the tour and lose money and creating a great deal of ill will with Maharishi and the four-star people, that we decided to abandon the balance of the tour. And we had to handle this very delicately, and I think it was a press conference was held, and we told the press that Maharishi became ill because of his trek through Europe prior to coming to this country with the filming with Four Star. He became very ill, and when he did arrive in this country, he was, in fact, very ill and wasn't getting any better, and so that he was convalescing somewhere in Santa Barbara. But in fact, he left the country.
TM from an album by Charles Lloyd called Waves, and featuring the voices of Mike Love, Carl Wilson, Hal Jardine, Billy Hinchy, who's Carl's brother-in-law, and Pamela Holland. Alan, Mike and Carl, to different degrees, have all retained their involvement in TM right to the present day. So not surprisingly, perhaps, Mike Love doesn't see the failure of the tour with the Maharishi in quite the same way as Nick Grillo.
We'd had this idea to go on to some of the major liberal arts universities, and we'd play some music and Maharishi would speak. And it wasn't thought of as a venue, a show or something, and yet we went away. We came back and found out that this promoter that was handling the tour had put it into all these city arenas and things like that. It just didn't feel right. It just wasn't the kind of a thing where you'd ask 4, 5, and 650, you know, or whatever it was. It was more or less of a departure from that, we had hoped, and go to the major liberal arts colleges, of which there may be 10, 20,000 students, and play for a low ticket price and just kind of bring that awareness to them of what TM was really about. So from that point of view, I was disappointed that it was mishandled.
It was Dick Duryea who had to coordinate the tour for the Beach Boys and find a promoter for it.
We hired for this a man called Bud Filippo in New York City, a promoter who had quite a few contacts with DJs and things around the country. And we worked up quite a good tour. We had Philadelphia, the Spectrum, an 18,000-seat arena, and, you know, it was a big thing. The biggest fiasco of my life ever I've been involved with. The Maharishi was a nice man, but nobody wanted to listen to him. They came to see the Beach Boys, and we went on stage, started talking. They all left. So we played 3 dates, and we canceled the rest of them. But Mike dearly loves the man and his philosophy, and I don't put him down for it. I just remember the times that we held the aggravation and problems we went to, and they must have lost $250,000 on that tour.
The classic line of this whole thing was rendered by Al Jardine, and that was in Newsweek magazine. We were able to get a feature story in Newsweek magazine after the tour, and Alan Jardine's line was that the only people that would make money on this tour would be the florists in the various cities. And I mean, that summed up, I think, the whole Maharishi tour. I think there was such profundity in that statement that I realize it more and more each day. It was just classic.
Perhaps the real definition of flower power. Fortunately, there was no lack of enthusiasm for the Beach Boys in Britain, and as far as their singles were concerned, they're all set to do it again. another big success in Britain for the group, in fact reaching #1 in the charts for just 1 week early in September. It was much needed encouragement too, because at this point they were still not doing too well in America.
There was a time in 1968, believe it or not, when the Beach Boys drew 200 people in New York City. Believe it or not. And then we went to England right after that and sold out a whole tour. I mean, it's so crazy.
Bruce Johnston. And for that tour in late November of 1968, it was once again Bruce who did much of the legwork for publicity purposes. Here's Roger Easterby.
He was very conscious about getting himself known because he was replacing Brian Wilson, who was God. And the funny thing about the Beach Boys is that he was always going to be with them. And yet not once on a tour did he ever come. It was always a last minute, oh, Brian hasn't come. But every time the British fans were promised that he would be with them. And he never was. And getting back to Bruce Johnston, he was the one that would always do anything. In fact, when they were in America between tours, he would ring me at 12 o'clock midnight with an idea. He was always pushing that group's image, and I think they owe a lot to Bruce that hasn't been said for the fact that he was very instrumental in always pushing them, and he would be the one that would always do the interviews. If the other members of the group say, oh, we'll do it tomorrow, Bruce would say, no, I'll come and do it now. And I think this was twofold. One reason because he was new and he had to project Bruce Johnston being the new member, but also he realised how important it was to keep the group at the top at all times, and I think his influence came through in a lot of ways. I always remember, because I'd first been in contact with Bruce years before when I was at CBS, and he was a member of a duo called Bruce and Terry, and they'd made a record called 4 Strong Winds, and Bruce always told me that if he ever went solo, he would do a record of Bluebirds Over the Mountain. And it's quite funny to see that the new single by the Beach Boys was Bluebirds Over the Mountain, which I think proved that he had a lot of influence later on in the group as well, but he very much was the leader off stage of the group, although Mike Love in fact was the general on stage, and you know, he controlled every movement, what they did and how. Off stage it was very much Bruce Johnston who decided what they would do in the ways of promoting their image, and nothing was ever too much trouble for him.
Well, as Roger Easterby said, their new single released to coincide with the tour was Bluebirds Over the Mountain, and while the group were in England, their concert at the London Palladium was recorded, including the latest single. The live version of Bluebirds Over the Mountain. The B-side of the studio version was a song credited to Dennis called Never Learn Not to Love. Now, in many ways, Dennis is the most independent of all the Beach Boys, but this independence sometimes led to a certain amount of carelessness in his choice of friends, as their ex-publicist Derek Taylor recalls.
Dennis and his lame ducks. Dennis had always got a friend who was fantastic, who we had to take care of. Some of them stranger than known, weren't they?
Well, unfortunately, one lot did become very well known a little later. Nick Grillo remembers how Dennis met up with them.
He was traveling out near Malibu, I believe, one of the canyons, and he picked up a young lady that was hitchhiking, and I believe that she was hitchhiking with a friend of hers to the nearest gasoline station, and in inquiring as to who she was and where she was heading, she said that she was part of this caravan that was down from San Francisco, a bus, and consisted of about 11 or 12 gals and this one guy. And so he invited her, after the bus was repaired, to come visit him at his house that he was renting out in Pacific Palisades. And lo and behold, the bus did arrive there with the entourage, and the one male leader of this entire troop was Charlie Manson. And they stayed with Dennis for about, I believe it was close to 6 months. And during that period of time, Dennis was traveling with the boys on the road, and either Charlie himself or one of his clan members would come up to the office and pick up a check for food or an allowance check, because they were supposedly keeping an eye on the house while Dennis was away. They were driving Dennis's Ferrari, which always infuriated me, and we had all to do to maintain proper insurance coverage for Dennis because of his driving record, and he was letting, some of these kids drive a $20,000 car. And so I wanted to know a little bit more about Manson, and I found out that he was down from San Francisco on probation, and he was involved in some sort of a holdup. He needed some employment down here, and so through the pressures placed upon us by Dennis, we sort of indicated that through his local probation officer that it would be fine for him to stay down here, because we were entertaining the thought of signing him on to Brother Records as a writer. And he would come up to the office and serenade the office staff from time to time, and we had to sometimes shout him out of the office because he would be interfering with the normal workflow of the day. I never went out to the house. I mean, other members of the group went out to the house because, you know, finding out one guy with 11 chicks, I mean, that's sort of a magic thing. And I wanted to find out what Charlie possessed. I believe at one point Dennis was under a great deal of pressure from Charlie Manson, and I think that he was getting much heavier into a drug situation, which Dennis started to become concerned about and very frightened. And the use, I think, of hard drugs. It was no longer just marijuana. I think Charlie at the time was literally taking tremendous amounts of acid, and Dennis was getting concerned and wouldn't tolerate it and asked Charlie to leave. And I know it was a very difficult time for Dennis because he was literally afraid of Charlie. I mean, what took place there for 5 or 6 months must have been a nightmare to Dennis as he saw the personality of Charlie evolve, and he wasn't really that benevolent sort of a guy that he wanted everyone to think that he was. And I think what frightened Dennis more than anything else is just thinking about the fact that Dennis was sleeping under the same roof with him. Could have just axed him up one night. Dennis literally said that. He was shuddered when he thought of what could have happened to him after the whole Manson incident.
That song, Never Learn Not to Love, is, as I said before, credited to Dennis Wilson. But once, when he was asked if it were true that Charles Manson actually wrote the lyrics, he said that it was, and that he paid Manson a considerable amount of money for them. As Dennis has the same facility as elder brother Brian for putting people on, it's difficult to know where the truth lies, and nowadays Dennis, perhaps not unnaturally, declines to talk about the whole Manson affair. What is certain is that Manson himself did record many of his own songs.
As a matter of fact, we recorded close to 100 hours of Charlie Manson's music up at the studio, Brian's studio. And I know that when that whole thing took place, we took the tape and put it in the vault. And, you know, no one realized the extent of what had taken place. And, you know, I had called up Time Life magazines in New York, and I thought that maybe some sort of a deal could be made with the tapes, you know, as a study on this guy's personality. I mean, not, you know, just to make money and release an album and have it on the charts. I mean, about really a medical type situation, because his music was, his lyrics were so twisted and jaded.
In March 1969, the Beach Boys' last album for Capitol was released, simply called 2020. It was an important album because it provided further proof that much of the writing and producing pressure had now been shared by the group, along with Brian.
I think that was when we were all starting to become active. I think that's the thing about 2020, because I can see The Nearest Faraway Place, which Bruce did, and Cotton Fields, which is a song that Alan had wanted to do for quite a while. And Bluebirds Over the Mountain is a track that Bruce did on his own. I think he had a couple of guys play bass and drums, and it just started from there. And Dennis on Never Learn Not to Love. And Our Prayer, which was sort of an introduction to a prayer Brian had written, which was going to be for Smile. Cabernet. It was easy.
The last track Carl Wilson mentioned there, Cabernet, was one of the tracks that had originally been recorded for the Smile album, and now had been revised and re-recorded. Cabernet, written by Brian Wilson and Van Dyke Parks. Well, yet another tour of Britain had been set up for the Beach Boys in late May and early June of 1969, and this time they were to do dates in Brighton, Hammersmith, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester and Glasgow. On that particular tour of Britain, the group came over with Paul Revere and the Raiders, who were little known in this country and remained so even after the tour. On the face of it, it's a strange move to have made. Bruce Johnston.
Yeah, well, that was a mistake. We shouldn't have toured with the Raiders because it was a bubblegum kind of band. But we didn't have any direction. Unfortunately, when you don't have a manager, you don't have good perspective. You need a manager that is as good as you as an artist to give you some guidance. So we were making our own decisions, and a lot of them were really dumb. We wanted to see them happen in Europe because they were friends of ours, but it was the wrong combination. We should have taken Fairport Convention with us on the tour. I happen to be a big Sandy Denny freak.
Yeah, me too. As expressed by Bruce Johnston, the mistakes they made certainly seem symptomatic of the overall lack of direction that there was at the time. Just as they arrived in Britain, the news broke of a press conference that Brian had been given in Los Angeles, disclosing that the group were on the verge of bankruptcy. Nick Grillo, their former business manager, explains the position.
The boys, from an asset and liability point of view, had healthy financial statements. The problem that we did face was the cash flow. In other words, not having sufficient cash. We'd had excellent borrowing power, and we did borrow against some very important type investments to sustain us through some very difficult periods. We had to maintain a certain level of, I guess, an image, because we had to maintain an office. I mean, their affairs are very complex, requires full-time employees, and at the same time accommodate all of our creditors that were literally breathing down our backs. And it took us, I would say, about 2.5 years to really get our heads above water, because for a period of 2 years, we were then involved in litigation with Capitol Records, and Capitol wasn't really, I feel, getting behind our product, and I don't think the boys themselves were really mentally prepared to really get into their own recordings, and the problems just magnified themselves, and for 2.5 years it was a nightmare.
Add Some Music to Your Day was from Sunflower, a beautiful album and the first record of the Beach Boys to be released by Warner Brothers in America, and which carried their Brother Records logo alongside that of Warner Reprise on the label. As I mentioned earlier, the Beach Boys themselves had reverted to the plain Capitol label after Smiley Smile, but they had managed to keep Brother Records itself going, although with some difficulty.
We had signed several acts to Brother Records. We brought in an outside black producer. We signed a couple of writers out of New York. And we had a staff. We had about 4 people at the time writing for us and cutting sides, and trying to really launch Brother Records as a label that would have different facets of music, and of course being headlined by the Beach Boys particularly. And as everybody just put pressure on the boys did not become interested in pursuing Brother Records. The enthusiasm wasn't there because they weren't getting the enthusiasm from the people that should have been behind them and pushing them. And I'm not talking about Capitol Records either.
Well, with the Capitol contract expiring in mid-1969, the group now had a chance to look around for a company that would take them on as Brother Records and give them the artistic freedom they so urgently needed. Nick Grillo again.
A great deal of interest was displayed by Deutsche Grammophon. And we negotiated a major deal with Deutsche Grammophon whereby I believe it was a 14-album deal over a period of 3 years, and I believe 6 of the 14 albums consisted of Beach Boy product, and the other product would be new artists. We were in Berlin reviewing the deal with the boys, and at the time Mike Love did not feel particularly satisfied with the deal. And I criticized Mike about it, and I could not understand why we had to wait until we returned to the States before we accepted the deal, because the deal could have been accepted right there in Berlin. But I feel in the long run that was the best move, that we did not fulfill that commitment with Deutsche Grammophon. And so we came back to the States, and we also were receiving a great deal of interest from Warner Brothers. Mo Austin had tremendous belief in the boys, Brian Wilson, and literally wanted them on the label. And realizing that they hadn't been selling that many records, and again, one of his classic comments was that he had a gut feeling that the boys will be a major force again in the music field, and he wanted them on his label. He definitely wanted them. And we negotiated a deal. It was Brother Records. The boys would be recording exclusively for Brother Records, but we could not really get Warner's to shift from their position of just having the boys and not developing any other acts until things started to happen for the boys. Their careers came first in his mind, and he wanted to see them get back into the mainstream, and then we'd start developing other artists. And I think he was right. Yeah, he was definitely right.
Another track on the Sunflower album when it was released was the second song to emerge from the Smile period, Cool, Cool Water, Al Jardine.
Remember, it took 48 hours to dub down Cool Water. Bruce and Carl and I were there for 2 sunrises, if you can believe that. That was interesting. It felt like Lewis and Clark, just, discovering the Grand Canyon or something. The third day rolled or second day rolled around. It was done. I just felt like I'd arrived, And then we rushed it over to Warner Brothers that day and got the typical A&R flip out from everybody, Wow, great. And they were really impressed. They really liked Cool Water, and we thought it was really good. And again, it was one of those things, technically I think so really acceptable, but commercially so subtle. It wasn't AM, let's put it that way. Great FM stuff, though.
Cool, so cool, cool, cool. I may not always love you, but long as there's what I'd be without you.
One of the tracks the Beach Boys had recorded for 2020, their last album for Capitol, was an arrangement that Al Jardine and Brian Wilson had made of the old Huddy Ledbetter song Cotton Fields. Eventually, Capitol decided that they wanted to release the song as a single, so the group returned to the studios and recorded a rearranged and punchier version for the singles market. Cotton Fields, and that record reached number 5 in the British charts in June 1970. The success of that single in Britain prompted EMI to put it as the opening track on the Sunflower album, which they released on their stateside label in Britain. Although the group were now with Warner Brothers in America, their contract with EMI in Europe still had a while to run. So Cotton Fields was never really intended for Sunflower. It isn't included on the American version, and to my mind doesn't really seem to fit with the rest of the LP. Anyway, a couple of songs that Bruce Johnson wrote for the album were Deirdre and Tears in the Morning, and the latter appeared as their next single in Britain.
I think Tears in the Morning was too pop. It just doesn't fit the group. It was my mistake. I think it's a lovely song, a lovely arrangement, but it's just not right for our group.
What about Deirdre?
I don't even like Deirdre. I rewrote it and made it a lot funkier. It's too saccharine-y. I was just experimenting with those songs, but I think now I wouldn't put them in. I wouldn't even cut them like that if I were cutting them now. And I wish I never had recorded them with the group. I don't think it helped the group at all.
Bruce Johnston being very frank about his own compositions. In August 1970, Jack Riley came to work for the Beach Boys, ostensibly to handle press and publicity. In his previous capacity as a journalist, he'd interviewed them for a public service radio network in America, and later Bruce and Mike had asked him if he would work for the group.
Part of the tacit agreement under which I would come to work with the Beach Boys is they'd have to agree to change a few things around. And one of the things, and we did it in a series of advertisements, was to just say it right out. It's safe now to listen to the Beach Boys. And I remember that was a headline in one of the first ads we ran. You have to remember, and listeners in England might find this puzzling, but Pet Sounds was not a successful recording by Beach Boys standards in the United States, unlike England. We ran another ad, I remember. I got a letter from somebody. I think it was from Houston, Texas. A guy who said he walked into his record store and bought a Beach Boys album, but he sandwiched it between one by Jethro Tull and one by some other group. And he just didn't want it to be too well known by his buddies that he was listening to the Beach Boys. And we used that story in an ad. It was sort of silly, but people were afraid to say they were into the Beach Boys. I think 2020 and Sunflower had been real disasters sales-wise, although Sunflower is one of the finest recordings I've ever heard by anybody. Okay, so we got rid of the white suits and we started addressing ourselves to the real problem in the media, started doing concerts unlike those which the Beach Boys had done in the past. We had an offer to play at the Big Sur Folk Festival in Monterey with Joan Baez and some other people. Anyway, part of the agreement was that they would do it. They did so without Brian, but nevertheless the group was extremely successful, and it was just what we really needed to get things rolling. They had not done festivals before. I'm not sure why, though. Some people in the group seemed really apprehensive about them, but I remember we changed the order of the songs in the performance round drastically, dropped some numbers entirely, threw in some album cuts, which they hadn't done on stage much, and I thought it was a great show. I remember it very well now. It was an outdoor show.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beach Boys.
Very nice. And I think that's really what started things. Shortly thereafter, we got an offer to play at Carnegie Hall in New York from two fellows who had not really been promoters ever, Mike Klenfner, who is now a successful promotion man with Columbia Records, and Chip Racklin, who is now the Beach Boys' agent. He is with International Famous New York. And two very green promoters who offered much too much money for the Beach Boys to do a performance at Carnegie Hall. Of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, there was actually discussion about it. I can't remember why. But we took the offer, and that was the other thing that really pushed things over in a very, very strong way. And I think the Beach Boys have a lot to thank Mike and Chip for that offer in regaining a lot of what they had lost, particularly in the United States.
The recording of the Beach Boys at the Big Sur Monterey Folk Festival is on an album called Celebration, and other artists on that LP include Joan Baez, Linda Ronstadt, Mary Clayton, Country Joe McDonald and Chris Christopherson, and the proceeds went to the Institute for the Study of Non-Violence. As Jack Riley mentioned, another important turning point for the group was the concert they did in February 1971 at the Carnegie Hall, New York, and one of the two guys who organised it was Chip Racklin.
For a time I was working at the Fillmore, and some friends of mine and I knew that the Fillmore would not book them because they hadn't drawn very well. And because we wanted to see the group, we decided to see if Carnegie Hall was available. This was November 70. And we arranged for a date in February for the boys to play at Carnegie Hall. At this point, there was no professional affiliation. It was just a group of people who wanted to see them get a shot. And we worked for about 4 months on that concert, and it eventually sold out the night of the show.
And at Carnegie Hall, we did the show alone. It was a 2-hour concert, and that was very, very new. There was no opening act. Instead of the Beach Boys going on and being a jukebox of 45 minutes of their latest hits, they instead did 2 hours and really did some good artistic material. I think that part of this was in response, frankly, to the November-December 1970 European and British tour, in which the Beach Boys did 45, 50 minutes. They were terribly, terribly dissatisfied with it. Some of the critics didn't like it, and it wasn't the group. And so we changed all that. At that time, it was the old boom, boom, on and off with a strange guy, not a very good comedian. I can't remember his name, but I can remember the jokes, and they were very sad. And a couple of opening acts. They wouldn't last very long. We also had the Flame with us. It was Ricky, Blondie, and Ricky's two brothers. It was just bad. It was really bad. Well, that tour was, for us, from an artistic standpoint, a disastrous tour. And I think it was with that that I was able to sell the group completely on the idea of being themselves. I think that certainly 50% of the people who come to their concerts are there to hear Brian Wilson's music. And by that I mean the music from Pet Sounds and to before. And I think that's fantastic because I happen to love that music. But I know that there's other music they do as well. And I've never been personally as gratified as I was when I think it was Long Promised Road got the biggest ovation in the show. That's on Surf's Up. So I think it was accepted by people. We didn't want to have people turn off to what the Beach Boys were, but only to be aware that there was still stuff going on, and it was also very exciting music, and still is.
So hard to answer futures.
Well, that's a superb recording. Carl's Long Promised Road from the Surf's Up album, released in the autumn of 1971. Both this one and the previous LP, Sunflower, were released in quadraphonic sound, but at the moment on the radio in this country at least, we'll have to make do with stereo. Going back to Sunflower for a moment, there's a line on the back cover that says, P.S. Thanks to Nick from all the Beach Boys. Well, by the end of 1971, the relationship between the group and their business manager, Nick Grillo, had gone sour.
The departure from the Boys came quite suddenly. We were having some problems in terms of career direction and problems concerning finances. Some of the boys wanted to be more involved actively in the financial aspect of their careers, which always bothered me, and I wish some of them had shown the same amount of enthusiasm when it came to cutting material. I think the part that disturbed me more than anything else is that I guess they had the right to dismiss anyone that they wanted to dismiss, but it was the way it was done. I was notified from the road by my associate and my colleague that I was not to return to the office beyond a certain point. I think it was on a Thursday, and I think Friday was my last day. I did receive a call from Carl, and it seemed to me that possibly some of these differences could have been resolved, and he was to call me back, and he never did. And I believe there was an attempt by certain people in the organization to shield the boys from me and not give me an opportunity to defend myself on certain allegations that had developed that I was not a party to, which is very painful. I felt that an injustice was perpetrated. A year later, other dismissals took place, and I think that, in essence, that sort of, I feel in my own mind, exonerated me from a lot of the ill will that had taken place.
When Derek Taylor had worked as a publicist for the Beach Boys in the 60s, he'd seen how hard Nick Grillo worked for the group and just how aware they were of their money.
Very aware of it, and very silly with money, but they all needed it. I mean, when I say all, now I'm talking about the four who had control, which is the brothers and the cousin, Mike, and very, very interested in money, huge spenders, and then the usual desire to wrangle with the record company, which happens at some point in every successful band's career. Where's our money? Insist on audits and all that. So money, 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 money. A lot of the time, yes. They're not mean with it, you know. Nick Grillo, their manager then, business manager, was in the hottest seat in the world. I never saw a man under more pressure than Nick Grillo in my life. Seen many people under pressure, but never anyone under the pressure Nick Grillo was under. There was so many of them, first of all buying, selling cars, houses, or whatever. I mean, and all changing their minds. God, for mind changing. You've just reminded me of a whole new area opened up in my mind when I think of Nick Grillo. A work freak anyway, sort of Des Brown type. 20 hours of work, fantastic, you know. But no drinking either, no eating, no time for anything, poor Nick. And that all turned to ashes in the end, I think, as well. I used to wonder, how the hell can this man go through all this without even moaning? Because I'm, as an habitual moaner myself, even when I'm doing well, always got some good moan going about something. But you'd never hear it, never complained to us. Nick thought whatever he did for them, or whatever sort of hell he went through, was the reward was somewhere in heaven, because these people were rather heavenly people. And it was okay. It's just the boys, you know. It's just the boys being... Boys will be boys. Yeah, back Nick anywhere. And he backed me. Fine.
But evidently not as far as the Beach Boys were concerned, for the severance of the relationship ended in a series of lawsuits in which Nick Grillo sued the Beach Boys and Jack Riley for monies he alleged they owed him, and they countersued, alleging mismanagement of some of their financial affairs.
No matter what the settlement was, I feel that it was unjust, and of course they feel that it was unjust. No one is particularly satisfied on the settlement. The only people that made money on this deal were the attorneys, and man, they ripped everybody off.
Meanwhile, the Surf's Up album, as well as being recognised as a true artistic achievement, was also selling well, and this time there was a Bruce Johnston song on it that he actually liked.
Now, I think Disney Girls does fit the Beach Boys. I came up with that song because I saw so many kids in our audience just be wiped out on drugs, and I mean really bad drugs, that I was trying to think of a time when I was really young and what it was like, and also being really naive. And I thought, well, let's see, 1957, what was going on in 1957 in my life? And I thought of a funny record. Well, it's not funny, it's old, so it seems funny to me. It's called Old Cape Cod by Patti Page, and it was a big hit here. So I started thinking about what I was doing, that record, and I wrote a song about going back in time, which is kind of dumb, you know, like American Graffiti. I remember back in 57 and 58 and 59, I was like 13 years old, and I was afraid to go on to high school, which is 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, because I always thought I was going to get beaten up. Anyway, I realized now how tame those times were, and I was thinking, gee, wouldn't it be nice to just go back there for a minute? Because it's just so hard these days with everybody kind of nodding out and overdosing, and that's kind of what the song is about, just people being a little naive but a little healthier.
Cloudy page and summer days on old...
Disney Girls, 1957, written by Bruce Johnston. But early in 1972, a statement was issued that Bruce had left the group by mutual consent.
The last tour I was on, I kind of felt strange because the group had gotten kind of clubby again. You had two guys, Mike and Al, that were deeply involved in meditation. You had Carl and Ricky that were kind of tight. You had Blondie, who was kind of alone, and Dennis wasn't quite sure of his role because he had an accident with his hand and he couldn't play drums for a long time, and he was trying to get used to the role of finally singing. And so the group kind of felt a little uncomfortable with each other, and we just kind of decided that it would be better to not play together and feel comfortable. And it was probably the right thing for me to do because now the friendship's better. And anyway, I had some music and some things that I wanted to do that I really couldn't do in the group. I mean, we must be friends because we've sung on a lot of sessions together since then, and I've sung on a few Beach Boy albums, and I occasionally play with the group, so there's no bad feeling between anybody.
At that time, there was still no sign of Brian on the road, and some people had almost begun to wonder if he was really still around. A problem for the group and for Jack Riley.
We didn't want to give an illusion of something which did not exist, and how to get over that, I think, was a big problem. I think we did it simply by just trying to encourage him to go into the studio more frequently. This culminated when one day I was going to Warner Brothers. I was driving to Warner Brothers, and I thought I'd stop at Brian's. I was going to have a meeting with Mo Austin, and I said, Brian, why don't you come with me, see Mo? And he said, okay, I will. He said, the president of Warner Brothers, I don't know what I'm going to tell him. We started on the drive over to Burbank from Bel Air. And suddenly Brian said, well, all right, if you're going to force me, then I'll do it. This was out of nowhere. And I said, force you to do what, Brian? And he said, to put Surf's Up on the album. I had talked to him about putting the song Surf's Up on the next album, which at that time was tentatively titled Landlocked. And this was the first album with which I would have had an association. And I said, you mean you're really going to do it? And he said, well, if you're going to force me. And it was a fantastic thing, and I loved it. And we got into Warner Brothers, and With no coaxing at all, Brian said to Mo, well, I'm going to put Surf's Up on the album. And I think this was something that helped us a great deal, really, because it did provide a commitment on Brian's part to become very active in the studio. And in my way of thinking, still, and I listen to a lot of records these days, there's some marvelous artists out there, but to my ears, there's still no one who can accomplish things in production as Brian can.
A diamond necklace played the pawn, hand in hand, son drove the lawn.
My involvement in the Beach Boys stemmed from a desire to have them heard by more people. My desire to have Surf's Up on the album was because I wanted to have the record. A very selfish motivation, I'm afraid. Carl did a tremendous amount of work. Brian did some work on it as well. We did the entire track on the first section over again and then scrapped it because it didn't quite come up to the original track. Carl had to sing the lead on the first portion of the record. He didn't want to. We wanted Brian to initially, and I think psychologically there was so much intensification that Brian was the only person who could sing that part that when Brian decided ultimately not to, it put Carl in a difficult position because he too was sucked into that myopic viewpoint, as was Steve Desper, the engineer of the Beach Boys, and was I, that was Brian that had to sing that. But I remember Carl and I sat in the studio, which at that time was at Brian's house, for a couple of hours, one late afternoon, early evening, and Brian was somewhere else in the house, I don't know where, and Carl suddenly hit that high note that's included in the first portion twice, in the first and second verse, and he really did it well. He read that lyric beautifully. The second portion is Brian from the original recording. Then the final portion, the tag, the child is the father of the man portion, is something we all got involved in. I know Alan has a very important part on that. Carl sings a couple of parts. Michael, I'm on it. A guy who worked for us part-time named Bill DeSimone sings on it. He just sings Hey Hey, but it's integral to the tag of that record. That was a lot of fun doing the tag of Surf's Up. And the lyric, which Van Dyke Parks put to the song, is my favorite lyric of all time. I think it's one that has to be read very carefully, done very, very carefully.
And considering that Jack Riley wrote the very fine lyrics to some of the other songs on the Surf's Up album, his remarks are praise indeed. Incidentally, on A Day in the Life of a Tree, which Jack wrote with Brian, he was eventually talked into singing the lead vocal for the song by Brian. By the next album, however, even more help was at hand in the shape of Blondie Chaplin and Ricky Fattar, who Bruce Johnston mentioned earlier. They'd originally been part of a South African group called Flame, which the Beach Boys first saw in Blazes Club in London. Carl had then produced an album with them in America, but the group didn't have too much success, and after disbanding, Ricky and Blondie first toured as backup musicians with the Beach Boys, and then joined the group officially in March 1972.
Jack Riley had this idea to have me and Blondes join the group, and I just thought it was just so ridiculous. It just didn't seem possible because it seemed like such a tight-knit family thing, you know. And when we first joined the group, it was weird adjusting, you know, because we were always being asked questions. The most aggravating one after a while was, how does it feel being a Beach Boy, you know? And we're not Beach Boys, you know? I mean, we just musicians, I guess. We joined the band after some of the cuts of Call and the Passions were cut already. Actually, we joined the band when we were in London. Came back and just recorded this album like so quick. And then we were out on the road and it seemed like we just stopped.
What were your tracks on Call and the Passions?
Hold On Brother and Yes She Comes. And they were just so far removed from what the Beach Boys were doing, it was embarrassing.
But presumably they left you to do them the way you wanted to?
That was really great about it. Because we had like 3 different studios going at the same time. Because Dennis was recording over there, and Carl and I was here, and Mike and I were, you know, it was just like, we kept changing. You know, we just sleep and we go back and sleep and go back. But they left us to do entirely what we wanted to do. In fact, that's why it sounds so bad. No. Really, I think if Carl had mixed it, it would have been really good, but it's just terrible. They let us learn.
It's fair to say, I think, that Carl and the Passions So Tough was relatively something of a disappointment when it was released. It certainly never attained the heights reached on the previous album, Surf's Up. But there were some nice things on it, like Cuddle Up, All This Is That, and this one, Marcella. Marcella, written by Brian Wilson and Jack Riley.
The title comes from Brian. It's about a girl who gave massages professionally in Los Angeles, named Marcella. I did the verses. The Hey Hey Marcella is Brian. Something's missing on it for me. It doesn't have that extra bit of energy.
Well, there's no doubt that some of Brian's energy at this time went into reactivating the group that his wife Marilyn and her sister had been involved in. Instead of the Honeys, the group were now called Spring. Brian wrote some of the songs for the album they recorded, provided some of the arrangement, did most of the production, and gave a lot of encouragement.
It really is practically all Brian's encouragement. See, Brian is always, I guess, related to, making his music for his family. He's always telling me that he loves my voice. And I tell him that I love his voice, but this is all genuine. He loves maybe like 3 different voices. And when one of them's mine, that's got to be pretty, to me, that's got to be pretty good. I mean, if he loves my voice, that makes me on top of the world. So it's all encouragement from him. And he loves the album. He says it's one of his favorite albums, and I know it. He's very proud of it.
Good Time, an unmistakable Brian Wilson production by Spring, or American Spring as they were now called. Well, the next big move in the Beach Boys' career was the one that took them lock, stock and recording studio to Holland. The impetus for the move came mainly from Carl and from Jack Riley.
I wanted to do it. It seemed like an interesting place. But most of all, I thought that it was important for the Beach Boys to do a record outside of California, to get away from that whole scene, to find a new environment and create in that new environment. It would not have been effective had Brian not come over as well. He did, later than the rest, but he did come over. The project resulted in a spiraling dollar and cents, pounds and pence, guilders and cents commitment. I really can't tell you what the total figure was, but it depended on what you included. We built a new studio board, flew it over from California to Amsterdam. We had at one time, I think it was 12 houses, 18 cars, housekeepers, dogs, all sorts of things. For a while, we even had a little weekly news service that would just deliver inter-organizational news. There were so many of us over here. I think there were 40 or 50 at one time, including families. It was quite a wild and hairy scene. But I think that the result, the Holland album, was worth it. I personally have looked back on this thing a couple of times, I hope with some level of objectivity, and come to the conclusion that an album of that quality could not have been made in Los Angeles at that time in the group's career.
As Jack Riley mentioned, after a few false starts, even Brian managed to make the trip to Holland, and once there really enjoyed himself, as Marilyn recalls.
That was a vacation for us. We loved it. It was hard coming back. It was hard only because everything's slower, you can relax and enjoy the air, which is something. Brian loved it. Oh God, he used to go on a bicycle, ride a bike every day. That's really something. It really is.
It may have been a holiday for Brian and Marilyn, but for the Beach Boys engineer Steve Moffat, the experience of moving from California to Holland was a harrowing one, to say the least.
The first I heard about it, Carl came in one night after a break and he said, think you can build a console in a month for us to go to Holland, because Jack wanted to go to Holland. It was kind of a shock because I'd only been there like a couple of weeks, And I said I'd look into it and see what we could do. I called a friend of mine, Gordon Rudd, who had been building consoles, and I talked to all the console builders in the city, and nobody would touch it in that time span. And we had worked together quite a bit in the past, building things, and I asked him if he would try it. Everybody else said at least 90 days, and we only had 2 months. By the time we got through planning, it was less than that. And we actually worked on putting the console together, this one, and all the other gear that goes with it. And we got it ready by June.
And after a few teething troubles, it all worked. The board itself is a masterpiece of electronic engineering, and when the Holland trip was all over, it was shipped piece by piece back to California and is now built into the Beach Boys' new studios in Santa Monica, along with the 24-track tape machine and enough electronic wizardry to produce any sound imaginable, and probably some that aren't. But was the stay in Holland all worth it? Carl Wilson.
Had we had time to think about it, I think maybe we would have decided against it for practical reasons, because it was really an expensive move on a business level, to spend that much money to make a record doesn't make sense, from that standpoint, but it was well worth it.
So the group returned to California, but Jack Riley enjoyed living in Amsterdam and for a while managed part of the Beach Boys' career from there. Eventually, though, this proved to be an unsatisfactory situation, and in October of 1973, they parted company.
I think the thing that caused me to pull away from the Beach Boys organization, not their music or anything else, but their organization, and that ultimately caused me to stay in Holland, was because of a terribly complex, complicated, and horribly distasteful situation involving aspects of their business and financial management. It was just raunchy. It was horrible, and put a terrible amount of pressure on me in an area I had never thought in my life I'd have been involved in. They had, though, professionals from time to time. I think what they need is trust. They need to get somebody in there now who they can, number one, trust and has enough faith in the Beach Boys and enough creativity to go out there and do something about it. Because I think now they're at another one of those many strange points in their career where they're going to need a big boost.
Well, a few months after we recorded that interview with Jack Riley, in the early part of 1974, it was announced in Los Angeles that the new manager for the Beach Boys was to be James William Gersier, previously known as the mentor and manager of the group Chicago. In the meantime, Blondie Chaplin had left the group in December 1973 at the end of a most grueling tour and after having had various disagreements with the other members of the band. More surprising, though, was the departure a year later of Ricky Fattar from the group, since he had had a particularly good understanding with Carl Wilson, as we've already heard from Bruce Johnston. During the course of that year, a new double live album, The Beach Boys in Concert, had been released. It would be fair to say, I think, that the live album doesn't entirely capture the excitement or the quality of performance that you get at a Beach Boys concert, and was somewhat of a disappointment. Under the guidance of new manager James Gersier, it was reasonable to assume that the renewed impetus the group had gained through the success of the live performances would be backed up by some new studio recordings that would reaffirm their world-class status. Well, their work with Chicago on Wishing You Were Here and with Elton John on Don't Let the Sun Go Down was impressive enough. But sadly, their own latest album, 15 Big Ones, with the exception of the superb It's Okay, really doesn't have the vitality of their earlier recordings, or the verve and sophistication of some of their later ones. It's difficult to understand why a group who are still so hugely successful with their own older material at live shows should at this stage of their career make an album largely comprised of tame versions of other people's hits when they themselves have so often expressed a desire to be accepted for their newer music. It could be that this is a stopgap album recorded to partially fulfill their contractual obligations with Warner Brothers. Then again, maybe Brian Wilson's trying to tell us something in this self-penned song from the 15 Big Ones album.
He knows what he's doing. He knows. It's even hard for me to, understand what he's really doing, but he's got it all in his head.
Marilyn Wilson's reassurance about husband Brian is echoed by the other members of the group, so we can only hope that somewhere in the creative pipeline there are more gems to come from him. The sheer quality of much of Brian Wilson's output over the years, and the brilliance and the precision of the musical arrangements and vocal harmonies is undeniable. Without doubt, the influence of the Beach Boys' music has been felt around the world, and nowhere more so than in their home country.
It's American music in the worst sense that every time you turn on the radio you get a commercial for anything. It's an infringement on Brian Wilson's techniques and sounds and style. I mean, every commercial practically on AM, FM radio is a steal from Brian Wilson. Direct steal. That's in the worst sense. In the best sense, all the groups in America, all the groups that do vocal sounds, they've all borrowed his perfection at getting the sounds right and the harmonies right. The use of the bass, the use of the voices, the use of the breaks, the change of tempos, they've all borrowed from him. I mean, I think Brian Wilson changed the sound of American music for the next 30 years.